Stone upon stone, the walls of Uruk rise like a hymn of fired clay against the long horizon of the southern Mesopotamian plain. In the late 3rd millennium BCE, when the floodplains of the lower Tigris and Euphrates shimmered with canals and temple smoke, scribes of the Sumerian king list inscribed the name Gilgamesh, whom later Akkadian tradition would call Gilgamesh, as a sovereign whose bloodline was 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal. The text, preserved on tablets dating to the 3rd dynasty of c. 2112–2004 BCE, records him not merely as a monarch, but as a living threshold between the imperishable gods and the frail sons of earth. His reign, set generations before the Great Flood remembered in the Atrahasis and Epic of Gilgamesh, became the axis around which the memory of Uruk turned. Uruk itself was already an ancient city by the time these chronicles were pressed into wet clay. Founded in the Uruk period around 4000 BCE, it had grown into a metropolis of monumental architecture. The White Temple of Anu, the Sky Father, the great Inner precinct dedicated to Inanna, mistress of love and war, and the colossal mud brick ramparts whose circumference later poets would measure as 6 miles of divine ambition. German excavations at Wakar, beginning in 1912 under Julius Jordan and continuing into the 1930s, revealed the remains of these very walls, fortifications more than 9 meters thick, layered in successive rebuildings like the palimpsest of a civilization's heartbeat. Cylinder seals recovered from these trenches bear the royal titles of Gilgamesh, confirming that the legend's hero was also a historical king whose memory outlasted his bones. The lament that opens the standard Babylonian version of the epic, compiled by the scholar-priest Sinlekian between 1300 and 1000 BCE, invites the listener to gaze upon these ramparts. Look at the wall of Uruk, the cuneiform lines command. Inspect the foundation terrace and examine the brickwork. Did not the 7 sages lay its plan? In those commanding imperatives echoes the Sumerian belief that the first architects were the antediluvian Apkallu, semi-divine sages sent by the gods to teach humanity the arts of civilization. The very bricks become scripture, fired clay testifying to a covenant between heaven and earth. Ancient hymns and city laments, such as the lamentation over the destruction of from the early 2nd millennium BCE, provide a ritual backdrop for this opening. They describe cities as living beings whose walls breathe and whose gates weep when abandoned by their tutelary deities. To the people of Sumer, a city was not merely a collection of dwellings, but the dwelling of the gods themselves, and the loss of divine favor was a cosmic catastrophe. Thus the prologue's call to contemplate Uruk's enduring masonry is both a boast and a warning. The walls endure, but the hearts within them perish. Archaeological layers at Uruk reveal the material counterpart to this theology. Beneath later Akkadian and Neo-Babylonian strata lie the great ziggurat terraces of the Inner complex, where archaeologists in the early 20th century uncovered dedicatory cones stamped with the name of Gilgamesh's father, Lugalbanda, himself elevated in myth to a minor deity. Such finds confirm the blending of royal and divine genealogy that the epic proclaims. The king's flesh may be mortal, but his lineage partakes of the eternal. His blood remembers the heavens. Comparative tradition amplifies this vision. The Hebrew Bible speaks of the Nephilim, mighty men of old, men of renown, born of the union of sons of God and daughters of men, Genesis 6:4. The Book of Enoch, cherished in early Judaism and echoed in Islamic narrations of the Watchers, tells of angelic beings who descended to instruct and to transgress. In the Greco-Roman world, Heracles and Achilles carried similar marks of mixed parentage, straddling the divide between Olympus and dust. Across these cultures, the pattern endures: the hero who is more than man yet less than God, destined to suffer the tension of mortality heightened by divine blood. Uruk's own texts, pressed into clay long before the Hebrew prophets or Greek rhapsodes sang, already mourned the impermanence of kings. Royal hymns from the early dynastic period, c. 2900–2350 BCE, praise rulers as shepherds appointed by Anu and Enlil, yet the king lists record their reigns ending inevitably in death, the throne passing like a shadow at dusk. Gilgamesh, for all his semi-divine stature, is introduced against this backdrop of unavoidable decay. The lament of his city is therefore the lament of all flesh. The ziggurats may reach toward the immutable stars, but the breath of kings is a mist that rises and is gone. When Austin Henry Layard's spades turned the soil of Nineveh between 1845 and 1851, and when Hormuzd Rassam unearthed the library of Ashurbanipal in 1853, the buried tablets of this ancient lament resurfaced after nearly 2.5 millennia of silence. George Smith's famous 1872 reading of the flood narrative shocked a Victorian world accustomed to the Bible as singular revelation. Yet long before these rediscoveries, the people of Uruk had already inscribed their grief in clay, entrusting their city's memory to the very element that endures fire and centuries of dust. Thus the epic opens not with triumph, but with the grave beauty of endurance. The bricks of Uruk stand as a testament to human striving and divine imprint, a city that outlived its king and a king who sought to outlive the sentence of death. In the echo of its walls, the listener hears the first toll of the theme that will haunt the entire saga, that even one who is two-thirds divine must face the night where every mortal walks, and only the name, cut deep into imperishable clay, can hope to resist the erasure of time. The cuneiform lines of tablet I proclaim without hesitation that Gilgamesh was fashioned of a measure beyond the common lot of men, two-thirds divine and one-third human, a ratio that defies the simple arithmetic of flesh and spirit. To the scribes of late second millennium Babylonia, compiling the standard Akkadian version between 1300 and 1000 BCE, this statement was neither metaphor nor hyperbole. It was a theological claim rooted in the ancient Sumerian conviction that the seed of heaven could mingle with the clay of earth, producing kings whose authority was not merely political but cosmic. The Sumerian king list, whose oldest exemplars date to the 21st century BCE, names Gilgamesh after a long line of antediluvian rulers whose reigns are counted in fantastical millennia, signaling a threshold where myth and history remain inseparable. His mother, the goddess Ninsun, the Lady Wild Cow, appears in early hymns as a celestial figure of wisdom and dream interpretation, and her cultic presence is attested in temple remains at Uruk and Clay tablets from the Ina precinct, excavated by German teams at Wekar between 1912 and 1934, preserve dedicatory inscriptions to Ninsun, giving archaeological weight to the epic's genealogies. His mortal father, Lugalbanda, was himself absorbed into the Sumerian pantheon as a protective deity of shepherd kings. Royal hymns discovered at Tel Abu Salabik and dated to the early dynastic period, ca. 2600 BCE, celebrate Lugalbanda as the young man of holy seed, a phrase that blurs the line between human ancestry and divine descent. Thus the epic's fractional mathematics, 2 parts divinity, 1 part dust, reflects a living Mesopotamian theology in which kingship was an office bestowed by the gods yet anchored in mortal vulnerability. Such mingling of heavenly and earthly essence resonates far beyond the floodplains of Sumer. The Hebrew scriptures, composed in stages between the 10th and 6th centuries BCE, preserve in Genesis 6:4 a haunting echo. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, men of renown. Ancient Jewish commentators, and later the Book of the Watchers within 1 Enoch, circa 3rd-2nd century BCE, elaborated this brief notice into a vast drama of celestial beings descending to teach forbidden arts, engendering giants whose violence summoned the deluge. The parallel is striking. Like the Nephilim, Gilgamesh stands as a hybrid of sky and soil, mighty in stature, restless in ambition, and doomed to learn that mortality cannot be evaded by lineage alone. Early Islamic exegesis of the story of Enkidu letter 1E25, Noah, likewise preserves memories of primeval titans, Uj ibn Anak and others, whose stature recalls the Mesopotamian hero kings. In Iranian tradition, the Persian epic Shahnameh, compiled by Ferdowsi around 1010 CE from far older Avestan and Middle Persian sources, celebrates Jamshid Yima, a luminous ruler who receives from Ahura Mazda a divine radiance known as Kh Varana, the royal glory that marks him as more than human. Jamshid's immense lifespan, his command over crafts, and his eventual fall through hubris mirror the Mesopotamian pattern, a sovereign radiant with godlight yet undone by the burden of mortality. Zoroastrian scripture, particularly the Vendidad, remembers Yima as both king and demigod, the first to construct an underground refuge before the cosmic winter, a distant reflection of the Mesopotamian flood survivor Utnapishtim. The Qur'an, revealed in 7th century CE Arabia, offers another figure whose ambiguity of nature and origin invites comparison. Dhu al-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, celebrated in Surat al-Kahf, 1883-98. Islamic commentators from al-Letter 1E60 Abri Macron, d. 923 CE, onward debated whether this mysterious traveler was Alexander the Great, a pre-Islamic Arabian king or prophet warrior granted extraordinary power by God. His journey to the setting place of the sun and the rising place of the sun, and his erection of a mighty barrier against the apocalyptic tribes of Gog and Magog, endow him with a scope that surpasses human limitation. Like Gilgamesh, he traverses the edges of the known world and mediates between mortal realms and divine command, a servant of heaven clothed in kingly form. The Hellenic imagination offers still another mirror. Heracles, son of Zeus and the mortal Alcmene, strode the landscapes of Greece and beyond as a hero whose labors defied human limits, yet whose death on the pyre confirmed his mortal share. Greek poets of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Homer, Hesiod, and the later tragedians, made of him a figure both tragic and triumphant, elevated to Olympus after death, but scarred by the agony of human suffering. The structural likeness to Gilgamesh is unmistakable: divine paternity, superhuman strength, and a narrative that culminates not in endless life, but in a confrontation with the boundaries of flesh. The conviction that bloodlines can mingle across the threshold of heaven and earth belongs to a broader ancient, Near Eastern theogony. In Sumer, gods and humans shared a porous cosmos. Deities feasted in temple courts, received offerings through intricate liturgies, and occasionally chose mortal partners. Akkadian hymns from the reign of Sargon, c. 2334–2279 BCE, speak of Ishtar's lovers and the sacred marriages enacted each new year between king and goddess to renew cosmic fertility. Archaeological strata from Ur and Kish, with their royal tombs rich in sacrificial attendance, bear witness to kings who claimed, and whose subjects affirmed, a nearness to the divine so absolute that death itself seemed only a temporary exile. Yet the Mesopotamian epic is not a simple hymn to immortal blood. It places on the lips of the elders of Uruk an admonition that even a body shaped by the gods must one day lie silent. The tension between Gilgamesh's extraordinary origin and his inevitable end drives the narrative like the deep current of the Euphrates beneath its glittering surface. The hero's unmatched vigor, his arrogance before the gods, and his eventual journey in search of everlasting life all flow from that paradox. The clay tablets, first recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in 1849 and deciphered by George Smith in 1872, allow us to hear across 4,000 years the ancient recognition that the mingling of heaven and earth does not cancel the decree of death. 2/3 divine is still 1/3 doomed. Through these resonances, Sumerian, Hebrew, Iranian, Greek, and Islamic, the figure of Gilgamesh stands as a universal emblem of the demigod king, luminous with celestial ancestry, mighty in the arts of city building and conquest, yet shadowed from birth by the certainty that the dust will reclaim the mortal fraction. His story endures because it speaks the oldest human question with unparalleled clarity: what profit is divine blood when the grave waits for all? Before the codes of Hammurabi carved justice into diorite, and long before the prophets of Israel and the jurists of Medina proclaimed a law for all flesh, the earth of southern Mesopotamia lay in a state where power itself was the only covenant. The opening cadence of the Epic of Gilgamesh speaks from this unshaped epoch, when the city of Uruk stood as the foremost jewel of Sumer, yet belonged to a cosmos not yet bound by the moral boundaries later ages would call righteousness. Kingship in this age was both sacrament and scourge. The king was ordained by heaven to shepherd the people, but his authority was absolute, and his failures echoed as cosmic disorder. Archaeology reveals the material splendor and severity of this world. Beneath the windblown sands of Wekar, the ancient Uruk German expeditions beginning in 1912 under Julius Jordan and resuming through the 1930s, uncovered the colossal Inner Precinct, its stratified levels reaching back to the late Uruk period, c. 3300–3000 BCE. Here rose temples faced with gleaming limestone and cone mosaic walls, the earliest monumental ziggurat terraces whose baked brick cores still bear the imprint of reed mats pressed 4.5 millennia ago. These structures were not mere civic halls. They were cosmic engines where priests reenacted the drama of creation, where the goddess Inanna's rites fused fertility and sovereignty, and where the king's offerings maintained the delicate equilibrium between sky and soil. Each layer of kiln-fired brick records an era when divinity and despotism shared the same altar. The very texts that give voice to this world were themselves drawn from clay. Cuneiform tablets, pressed with the sharp stylus of reed and hardened by time's fire, bear witness to the interplay of sacred duty and royal domination. At Nipur, a city revered as the spiritual heart of Sumer and the seat of the god Enlil, American expeditions under John Henry Haynes and Herman Hilprecht from the 1850s through the early 1900s unearthed temple archives and scribal schools. Among the thousands of tablets, economic ledgers, hymns, omens, are fragments of Sumerian poems that predate the Akkadian recension of Gilgamesh by centuries. These early texts portray a landscape where divine caprice and human ambition mingle. Kings boast of canal systems and victories, but the same inscriptions invoke deities who can overturn cities overnight. The later compilers of the Gilgamesh epic inherited these memories of a cosmos where law is not yet covenant but decree. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, brought to light by Austin Henry Layard in 1849 and expanded by Hormuzd Rassam in the 1850s, offered another trove of this primordial consciousness. Among the tens of thousands of tablets, myths of creation, celestial omens, medical incantations, scholars found the standard Babylonian version of the epic. Its prologue calls upon the listener to gaze upon Uruk's mighty ramparts, to read the tablet that records the king's labors, and to acknowledge that the city itself is a revelation. These words, set down in the 7th century BCE, yet copied from far older Sumerian prototypes, breathe the air of an era when the city-state was the highest order of existence, and the king's body was the axis between heaven and earth. In that archaic order, morality was inseparable from the cultic will of the gods. The king did not rule by social contract, but by divine appointment, a mandate renewed each year in the Enkidu festival, when sacred marriage rites bound the sovereign to the goddess, and thus to the fertility of the land. Yet the same divine mandate could sanction oppression. The epic itself opens with the people of Uruk crying out against Gilgamesh, who, strong to perfection, seizes sons for labor and daughters for his bed. Their plea to the high gods to create Enkidu as a counterbalance reveals a society where justice is sought not through codified law, but through supernatural intervention. The gods, not human assemblies, are petitioned to restrain the excesses of a king who is both protector and predator. This tension between sacred kingship and the suffering of subjects pervades Mesopotamian political theology. Early Sumerian royal hymns praise rulers as chosen of Anu and Enlil, shepherds of the people, builders of canals and temples. Yet city laments, such as those for and Eridu after the Gutian invasions around 2100 BCE, weep over leaders who failed to appease the divine assembly, bringing famine and ruin. Archaeological strata confirm the reality behind these laments. Layers of ash and collapsed walls at sites like Lagash and Adab attest to cycles of conquest and abandonment, each interpreted by the ancients as the withdrawal of divine favor. Within this milieu, Gilgamesh strides as both exemplar and warning. He embodies the sacred trust of kingship, the strength to raise walls that defy time, yet he also personifies the unchecked appetite that demands a divine remedy. The world he inherits is literally still in clay, cities of mud, bricks susceptible to flood, laws unwritten, morality fluid as the shifting Euphrates. Even the earliest attempts at legal codification, such as the reforms of Uruk of Lagash around 2350 BCE, lie centuries in the future. What endures are the temples and the tablets, the two media of permanence in a landscape otherwise washed clean by each spring inundation. To read these tablets today, hardened in the kilns of ancient scribes and rediscovered after millennia of burial, is to hear a civilization wrestling with the raw elements of authority and the divine. The Gilgamesh epic captures the moment when humanity first sought to inscribe memory against oblivion, when kingship was both an echo of the gods and a shadow over the people. It is a portrait of a society that had mastered irrigation, writing, and monumental architecture, yet had not yet bound its rulers to a moral law beyond the unpredictable decrees of the pantheon. In this sense, the world of Gilgamesh remains literally and figuratively a world still in clay, soft enough for the gods to impress their will, hardening only when the fire of history has passed over it, leaving the permanent script that we now unearth and read as testament to the first chapters of human sovereignty. From the first etched lines of tablet, the epic turns from the proud walls of Uruk to the still places of wilderness, where the goddess Aruru, midwife of the gods, kneads the dark soil into living form. At the cry of Uruk's oppressed citizens, whose voices ascend through the smoke of Inanna's temple toward the high assembly of Anu and the great Enlil, the gods decree a counterweight to the king who has grown too mighty for mortal measure. From the primeval riverbed, Aruru gathers clay slick with the breath of the Euphrates, mingling dust and divine spittle as once the creator deities shaped the first of humankind. Her incantation is a liturgy of balance. From the raw matter of earth she fashions Enkidu, a being of immense strength, his body shaggy with the hair of untamed beasts, his mind unburdened by the walls and laws of cities. The wild twin is born as a mirror and a restraint, destined to check the king's excess and remind the proud of their limits. The imagery of a human figure molded from clay belongs to the oldest stratum of Mesopotamian cosmogony. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on old Babylonian tablets of the 18th century BCE, recounts how the mother goddess Mami mixed the flesh of a slain god with clay to form the first mortals, so that humans might bear the toil the lesser deities refused. Still older Sumerian hymns from the late 3rd millennium BCE, recovered from the temple archives of Nippur during American excavations between 1889 and 1900, speak of mankind as ulu, those of clay, animated when the blood of a god quickened the dust. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation poem recited during the New Year festival of the 1st millennium BCE, the victorious Marduk commands that Kingu's blood be blended with earth to fashion humankind as servants of the divine assembly. Aruaru's act in the Epic of Gilgamesh is thus a deliberate echo of these primordial rites, a repetition of the first creation for the sake of restoring cosmic order. Across the ancient world, the motif of earthborn humanity reappears with striking fidelity. In the Hebrew scriptures, the Book of Genesis, composed between the 10th and 6th centuries BCE, proclaims that the Lord God formed Adam from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Early Jewish exegetes saw in this clay the sign of both humility and divine intimacy, a theme that resurfaces in the Qur letter 2b, a macron, NS revelation to Mohammed in 7th century Arabia, where Adam is shaped from letter 1e6d I macron n, sticky earth, and animated by the divine spirit. Greek tradition preserves a parallel in Hesiod's Theogony and later works and days, where the first woman, Pandora, is sculpted from clay at the command of Zeus, her body a vessel for both gift and doom. The very Greek word adamantinos, unyielding as metal, whispers the same root as Adam, the creature of ground. Archaeological witness confirms how central this image was to the earliest Mesopotamian mind. Excavations at Uruk's Ina precinct, first undertaken by the Deutsche Orientgesellschaft in 1912 and continued through the 1930s, uncovered votive plaques depicting goddesses kneading figures upon low benches, their hands poised in the timeless gesture of potters. Nearby, deep beneath later strata, layers of reed-tempered clay bear the fingerprints of artisans whose daily labor mirrored the myths they chanted. To shape is to create, to press clay is to imitate the gods. The very tablets upon which these stories survive, hardened in the fires of accidental conflagration or deliberate baking, embody the doctrine they proclaim, that clay receives the impress of spirit and endures when flesh has fallen to dust. Enkidu's formation is not merely an act of creation, but of cosmic jurisprudence. The citizens of Uruk petitioned the heavens because no earthly court could restrain the king who claimed ius divinum over their sons and daughters. The divine council's answer is not a new law but a new life, a being who stands outside the civil order altogether. Wild as the steppe from which he springs, Enkidu drinks with gazelles, ranges with the herds, and fills the traps of hunters with futility. The text delights in his otherness. He eats grass with the animals, his body clothed in matted hair, his mind innocent of war or kingship. He is nature unshaped, an echo of the antediluvian world when men and beasts shared a single breath. This wild birth also carries the shadow of rebellion. Mesopotamian religion often portrayed the wilderness as the realm where divine law is both absent and profoundly present, where spirits and demons roam, but where revelation may descend. The descent of Inanna, inscribed in the early 2nd millennium BCE, speaks of the 7 gates of the underworld where the boundaries of creation blur. Later Hebrew prophets would retreat to deserts and mountains to meet the voice of God, and Christian ascetics of the 4th century CE sought the same searing silence. Enkidu's emergence from the uncultivated plains anticipates these later traditions, presenting the wild as the crucible where divine purpose is revealed outside the structures of city and temple. When Austin Henry Layard uncovered the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in 1849, and when George Smith in 1872 first deciphered the flood narrative of Tablet XI, scholars soon recognized that the earlier tablets of the epic preserved these very scenes of primeval clay. Their rediscovery not only confirmed the antiquity of the biblical Adam, but also revealed the far older matrix from which that tradition had drawn its breath. Modern excavators at sites like Tel El Amarna and Mari continue to unearth administrative tablets whose incidental references to creation rites, offerings of river mud, invocations to the clay goddess Kusu, illuminate the everyday liturgy behind the myth. Enkidu's creation therefore stands at the confluence of myth and memory, theology and archaeology. He is the tangible answer to a civic lament, the embodiment of a cosmology in which gods shape life as a potter shapes a vessel, and he is the narrative hinge upon which the entire epic turns. For through his wild strength and untamed innocence, the king of Uruk will be forced to confront both his own mortality and the ancient truth that no wall of brick, however wide, can stand against the decree that first breathed dust into being. From the wilderness, where reeds shiver in the wind and antelope scatter beneath the rising sun, the hunter's complaint carries to the city of Uruk. A creature of impossible strength ruins his traps and frees the game. A wild man who drinks from the same watering holes as the beasts and whose body, clothed in matted hair, knows nothing of the plough or the yoke. The elders counsel a remedy not of spear or snare, but of sacred art. They summon Shamhat, a priestess of the inner temple of Inanna, whose body is consecrated to the goddess of love and war. She is sent with the hunter to the edge of the watering place, bearing not weapons, but the slow power of song, scent, and unveiled flesh. In tablet I of the standard Babylonian text, compiled around 1200 BCE, the encounter unfolds as a rite older than any city wall. For 6 days and 7 nights, Enkidu lies with her, and the breath of the wild becomes the breath of the hearth. The narrative lingers on the transformation. When the gazelles return to drink, they sense the difference and flee. Enkidu rises to follow, but finds his limbs heavy, his swiftness gone. The beasts reject him. The steppe itself will no longer claim him. Shamhat speaks with measured gentleness, calling him to Uruk, where Gilgamesh reigns, promising bread, beer, and the friendship of men. In her words and her body, the city extends its first invitation, not as conqueror, but as seducer, weaving civilization through the intimacy of desire. What no spear could capture, the sacred feminine subdues. Archaeological witness gives substance to this episode. The Ina precinct of Uruk, uncovered by German expeditions beginning in 1912 and continued into the 1930s, reveals temples dedicated to Inanna, whose cone mosaic walls once gleamed in the Mesopotamian sun. Here priestesses performed rites of sacred marriage, hieros gamos, embodying the goddess in ceremonies that renewed the fertility of the land and the legitimacy of kings. Cuneiform economic tablets from the Ur-III period, c. 2100–2000 BCE, record offerings of oil, incense, and finely woven garments for women of the temple who served not merely as attendants, but as vessels of divine presence. Shamhat stands within this tradition. She is no common courtesan, but an initiated mediator between mortal and divine. Her sexuality a sacrament rather than a transgression. Comparative traditions echo the theme of woman as civilizing force and threshold between innocence and knowledge. In the Book of Genesis, composed between the 10th and 6th centuries BCE, Eve stands in the garden as the one who tastes the fruit of wisdom, and through her act, Adam moves from unknowing simplicity into the realm of moral choice. Early Jewish commentators and later Christian theologians debated whether this was fall or ascent, but the pattern aligns with Enkidu's passage. Through the encounter with the feminine, the untamed creature becomes fully human, awakening to consciousness and mortality. The Qur letter to be a macron n, revealed in the 7th century CE, preserves this moment with equal gravity, naming Adam and his mate as joint participants in the awakening that follows the forbidden taste. The Sumerian goddess Inanna, known to the Akkadians as Ishtar and to the West Semitic peoples as Astarte, embodies the paradoxical blend of erotic love and cosmic power that Shamhat channels. Myths of the early 2nd millennium BCE, recovered from Nippur and Ur, tell of Inanna's descent to the underworld, her confrontation with death and resurrection, narratives that entwine sexuality with the renewal of life. In later Phoenician cults of Astarte and in the Greek worship of Aphrodite, the sacred feminine continues to bridge heaven and earth, desire and divinity. Shamhat's quiet authority belongs to this lineage. She does not merely lure Enkidu, but consecrates him, making of their union a liturgy of transformation. The civilizing banquet that follows their joining seals the change. Shamhat leads Enkidu to a shepherd's camp where bread is set before him and beer poured into tall vessels. The epic dwells on this moment. He eats bread until he is satisfied, drinks 7 cups of beer, and his heart grows light. His body, once alien to such sustenance, becomes strong in a new way. Archaeological evidence from Ur and Lagash, where brewing installations and bakery complexes dating to the 3rd millennium BCE have been uncovered, affirms the centrality of these foods as markers of civilization. In Mesopotamian thought, to share bread and beer was to enter the covenant of culture, to cross from the realm of beasts into the fellowship of humanity. Yet the taming is not mere domestication, it is initiation into destiny. Shamhat speaks of Gilgamesh, whose strength is mightier than yours, and plants within Enkidu the seed of rivalry and friendship that will define the epic. The goddess, through her priestess, thus shapes the future not by force, but by the quiet inevitability of attraction and word. In this, the story anticipates later mystical traditions, where feminine wisdom calls the seeker from wilderness into the city of God. The Song of Songs in Hebrew scripture, the Sophia of Hellenistic Judaism, and the personified wisdom praised in early Christian hymns. Modern discovery of the tablets that preserve this episode underscores its ancient power. When Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam uncovered the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh between 1845 and 1853, they brought to light the standard Babylonian text, whose first 2 tablets narrate the encounter. George Smith's translation in 1872 startled a Victorian world with the frankness of its erotic imagery. Yet Mesopotamian art and liturgy confirm that sexuality here is inseparable from sanctity. Cylinder seals from the Akkadian period depict divine couples entwined beneath the crescent of Sin or the star of Ishtar, emblematic of a cosmos where love is creation's own pulse. Through Shamhat, the epic reveals a profound theology, that the feminine is the mediator of culture and consciousness, the one who gathers the wandering strength of the wild and offers it bread, beer, and purpose. Enkidu's loss of speed is not a fall from grace, but an ascent into the intricate grace of humanity, where the heart is heavy with knowledge and the soul is bound to mortal time. The beast becomes man not by the hunter's arrow, but by the gentle, inexorable touch of the sacred woman. And in that touch, the ancient world recognized both the peril and the glory of civilization itself. The final act of Enkidu's awakening unfolds not in the hush of wilderness, but beneath the smoke of cooking fires, where the scent of leaven and malt rises like an offering to the gods. After his long union with Shamhat and the first steps toward the city, the wild man is brought to a camp of shepherds whose tents rest on the very threshold of Uruk's ordered streets. There, according to Tablet II of the standard Babylonian recension composed around 1200 BCE, he is seated among mortals for the first time. Before him they set bread, the staff of life, and tall cups of beer drawn from the sweet ferment of barley. Hesitant, he sniffs the unfamiliar fragrance, for until this moment he has fed only on grass and river water. At the urging of the priestess he tastes, and the change is immediate. He ate bread until he was sated, he drank 7 cups of beer, and his heart grew light, and his face glowed. With that glowing countenance, the text signals a crossing more profound than any battle, the passage from the untamed realm of the beast to the communion of the city. Archaeology gives weight to the symbols that the poet exalts. In the royal city of Mari, on the Euphrates, French excavations between 1933 and 1961, under André Parrot, revealed thousands of cuneiform tablets, palace archives, and banquet scenes painted on the walls of the great audience hall. These documents detail the meticulous preparation of bread and beer for visiting dignitaries and divine festivals, describing vessels of gold and copper, measures of finely ground barley, and the solemn toasts that sealed alliances. They confirm that hospitality was not mere courtesy, but sacred liturgy. To share fermented grain was to acknowledge the bonds of kinship and treaty, to bind wanderer and host within the same cosmic order. Enkidu's first meal is therefore more than nourishment. It is an initiation into the covenant of civilization itself. The Mesopotamian reverence for these staples reaches back millennia before the epic was committed to clay. At where Sir Leonard Woolley uncovered the royal cemetery between 1922 and 1934, tombs dating to the 3rd millennium BCE yielded drinking vessels, still stained with traces of beer, and bakery installations large enough to supply entire quarters of the city. Cylinder seals from the Akkadian period portray banqueters raising cups before the crescent of the moon god Sin, or the 8-pointed star of Inanna, the divine presence invited to the table. Bread and beer were not only daily fare, but the very emblems of settled life, the gifts of agriculture that distinguished the city from the steppe. To eat them was to accept the order of canals, fields, and temple rites, to become, in every sense, human. The imagery resonates across the sacred literatures of later ages. In the Christian Eucharist, recorded in the Gospels of the 1st century CE and elaborated in the Pauline epistles, bread and wine become the body and blood of the incarnate Word, a mystery in which divine life is offered through the fruits of cultivation. The chalice raised in liturgy echoes the cups of beer lifted in Sumerian feasts. The grain of wheat broken on the altar recalls the ancient barley loaves baked for the goddess. Zoroastrian ritual preserves a parallel in the Hayoma sacrifice, where a sacred plant is pressed to yield an intoxicating drink that bestows strength and immortality. Texts of the Avesta, redacted during the Achaemenid and Sasanian eras, 6th century BCE, 7th century CE, describe the Hayoma as the very essence of the Creator's vitality. In Islam, the Qur letter 2be a macron n speaks of rizq tayyib, the pure provision, and of gardens beneath which rivers flow, where the faithful are offered fruits and cups that neither intoxicate nor sicken, Q47:15, a transfigured remembrance of earthly sustenance sanctified in paradise. Enkidu's 7 cups of beer thus carry a symbolic weight far beyond their immediate intoxication. The number 7, sacred in Mesopotamian cosmology and preserved in the 7 days of creation in Genesis and the 7 heavens of Islamic tradition, marks completeness. His heart made merry, his body warmed, he steps irrevocably into the fellowship of men. The epic remarks that he washed and anointed himself with oil, actions paralleled in Near Eastern hospitality rites, where fragrant unguents honored the guest and invoked the favor of the gods. Archaeological strata at Ebla and Ugarit, where storerooms of perfumed oils have been found in 2nd millennium BCE contexts, attest to the antiquity of this practice. The shepherds who host him are more than rustic peasants. They represent the first city, the ordered society that will soon receive him fully within its gates. Through their simple meal, they transmit the wisdom of countless generations who learned to tame grain and yeast, to shape clay ovens and brew vessels, to turn the gifts of river and field into sustenance that endures. In their camp, the cosmic drama of civilization repeats itself, the raw bounty of nature transformed by fire and time, the wildness of man transformed by ritual and fellowship. When modern excavators uncovered the tablets of Nineveh in 1849 under Austin Henry Layard and the fragments of Mari in the 20th century, they restored to memory this ancient conviction that the table is the threshold of culture. Enkidu's transformation by bread and beer is not an incidental detail, but the very emblem of humanity's great transition from wandering hunter to builder of cities. Through the simple acts of eating and drinking, he joins a lineage that will stretch from the banquet halls of Babylon and the symposiums of Athens to the altars of churches and the communal feasts of Islam at the close of Ramadan. The clay-born creature who once lapped water beside gazelles now tastes the work of oven and fermenter, and in that taste he becomes the brother of all who dwell within walls. The first city receives him, not with sword or law, but with the quiet sacrament of shared bread and the deep amber joy of beer, a rite as old as civilization and as enduring as the tablets on which his story is written. The great walls of Uruk echoed with the sound of drums when Gilgamesh beheld the stranger who was his own reflection in raw clay. Enkidu, newly anointed with oil and clothed in the garments of men, entered the city gates as if the wilderness itself had come to challenge the throne. Tablet II of the standard Babylonian recension, preserved in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh and copied onto cuneiform tablets around 650 BCE, recounts the charged encounter. Citizens crowded the streets as the king, unmatched in strength, descended to meet the one fashioned by the gods to be his equal. Their first exchange was not of words, but of force. At the threshold of the bridal house, where Gilgamesh came to exercise his ancient right of first claim, Enkidu blocked the way. They grappled like primeval bulls, the pavement trembling beneath them, water jars shattering in the courtyards. Walls built of baked brick and reed crackled as two powers, mirror and counterpart, wrestled for dominion. The struggle is described in long, sinewed lines of Akkadian poetry, arms locked like bands of bronze, feet braced like cedar roots, the river scent of sweat rising as a storm. Yet when strength met strength, the contest dissolved not in death but in wonder. Gilgamesh, recognizing the measure of the other, broke into laughter, and Enkidu answered with the same. In that shared breath, enmity turned to recognition, the gods' hidden design fulfilled. The wild man who once roamed with gazelles and the king whose tyranny had driven his people to prayer clasped hands. The narrative calls their bond Kibrat Shah Shamir, a tie as wide as heaven, an oath of fraternity stronger than the bricks of Uruk itself. Dreams confirmed what combat began. On the nights that followed, Gilgamesh's sleep filled with visions of meteors and falling axes, symbols which, interpreted by his mother the goddess Ninsun, foretold a companion sent by the gods. The epic lingers on these nocturnal revelations, for in Mesopotamian belief, the dream was a sanctioned gate between mortal and divine. Records from the temple archives of Mari on the Euphrates, uncovered between 1933 and 1961, preserve royal letters in which omens and dreams directed the strategy of kings. Gilgamesh's visions belong to this sacred practice of oniromancy, where the night discloses what the waking world conceals. The oath of the two heroes carries echoes that resound across distant cultures. In the Homeric epics of the 8th century BCE, Achilles and Patroclus embody a warrior bond so fierce that grief drives Achilles to defy death itself. The ancient Sanskrit Mahabharata speaks of Arjuna and Krishna united beyond mortal kinship. Among the Germanic sagas, blood brotherhood rituals mingled oaths with the mingling of wounds, a practice remembered in the later Norse Fostbreathralag. Though separated by vast geographies, these traditions recognize a fraternity forged not by birth but by ordeal, a covenant sealed in struggle and mutual recognition. Within the Islamic world, the concept of ukhuwah, the spiritual brotherhood of believers, preserves the same conviction that shared purpose transcends lineage. The Prophet Muhammad's pact of brotherhood between the emigrants of Mecca and the helpers of Medina in the 7th century CE established a model in which allegiance to God and justice outweighed the ties of tribe. While distinct in theology, the resonance with the Gilgamesh, Enkidu pact is unmistakable, a fellowship sanctified beyond blood, a union of wills under heaven's gaze. Archaeological finds reinforce the ritual dimension of such bonds in Mesopotamia itself. From the city of Nuzi, 15th century BCE, come tablets describing formalized adoption contracts where unrelated men became brothers through shared oaths, meals, and gifts before the gods. At Ugarit, coastal tablets of the late Bronze Age record covenant feasts in which wine and bread sealed alliances under the watchful stars of Baal and El. These texts illuminate the cultural soil from which the Gilgamesh narrative grew, friendship as a sacred covenant, guarded by divine witness. The epic treats the union of Gilgamesh and Enkidu as more than companionship. It is the fulcrum of the king's moral transformation. Before Enkidu, Gilgamesh's might was unchecked, his desire for glory untempered. After their oath, heroism becomes shared pilgrimage. Together they will march beyond the walls of Uruk toward the distant Cedar Forest, where Humbaba, guardian of the gods, waits amid the resinous dark. The contest that began at the bridal threshold becomes preparation for a greater quest, a journey into the realm where mortal courage tests itself against the decrees of heaven. Thus the ancient poet binds personal friendship to cosmic order. Two men, one born of royal womb and one molded of wilderness clay, meet in a clash that should have ended in blood, but instead births fraternity. Their clasped hands, preserved in cuneiform lines buried for centuries beneath the sands of Nineveh, and brought again to light by Austin Henry Layard's excavations of 1845–1851, speak across 4 millennia that true kingship requires a companion equal in strength and heart, and that even in the earliest epics of humanity, the highest covenant is not of conquest, but of brotherhood. Beyond the irrigated fields of Sumer and the brick ramparts of Uruk lay a wilderness that no plough or canal had claimed, a range of shadowed mountains where the air itself was fragrant with resin and the soil dark with ancient loam. There, according to Tablet IV of the standard Babylonian recension, preserved on clay in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, copied circa 650 BCE, stood the Cedar Forest, realm of towering trees whose trunks reached like columns of a forgotten temple and whose crowns seemed to brush the constellations. This was no mortal woodland. The poem names it the dwelling of the gods, a place where Enlil, lord of wind and destiny, had set his chosen sentinel. Humbaba, called Huwawa in the older Sumerian tablets, was fashioned of terror itself, his roar a flood, his breath a storm that scalded the earth. 7 auras of dread, the teru or radiances, coiled around him like living fire. To fell even a single cedar was to challenge the decree of heaven. The journey of Gilgamesh and Enkidu toward this forest unfolds as a deliberate trespass against the limits imposed by the divine assembly. Armed with axes of bronze and dreams interpreted as omens of favor, the companions march westward across the dry steppe toward the spine of the Lebanon range. Their path follows the memory of trade routes already ancient in the 3rd millennium BCE, when Sumerian merchants sought the fabled timber of the Western highlands. Geological and archaeological studies trace these arteries of exchange. Cedar planks found in the royal tombs of excavated 1922–1934 by Sir Leonard Woolley, bear isotopic signatures matching the groves of Lebanon. Akkadian inscriptions of Sargon of Akkad, c. 2334–2279 BCE, boast of expeditions to the cedars of the Amanus, and tablets from Ebla and Mari detail caravans laden with aromatic wood for temples and palaces. The cedar forest of the epic, though mythic, stands firmly upon this geography of commerce and desire. Enlil's appointment of Humbaba as guardian reflects the high god's dual character as giver of life and stern enforcer of cosmic boundaries. In Sumerian liturgy, he is the Kurgal, great mountain, sovereign of wind and command, whose word fixes the fates of kings. Comparable figures appear throughout the ancient Near East. The Canaanites of the late 2nd millennium BCE revered El, the aged creator enthroned upon the cosmic summit, whose decrees the younger deities could not annul. Ugaritic tablets unearthed at Ras Shamra in 1928 describe El as Bul El, father of years, a title of the same gravitas that Sumerian hymns accord to Enlil. Centuries later, in the sanctuaries of pre-Islamic Arabia, poets invoked Allah al-Rahman, the merciful, as a sky-father whose benevolence was matched by the majesty of command. Though separated by language and epoch, these figures share the mantle of the distant, yet sovereign deity whose will establishes the world's order. The cedar itself carries a theology older than the written line. Its incorruptible wood, resistant to rot and rich with resin, became the material of temples and palaces from the Nile to the Persian Gulf. The roof beams of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, described in 1 Kings 5 and 6, 10th century BCE, were said to be cut from the forests of Lebanon, echoing the very trade that Sumerian kings had pursued 2 millennia earlier. To the Mesopotamian imagination, the cedar's height and fragrance marked it as a tree of heaven, a living axis between the underworld rivers and the unmeasured sky. To strike it down without divine sanction was an act of sacrilege. Thus the approach of Gilgamesh and Enkidu is told with mounting dread. Night after night, the king dreams of mountains collapsing, of tempests unleashed. Each vision, interpreted by the wise mother Ninsun, affirms both danger and destiny. When they stand at last before the forest gate, the epic lingers on the sensory majesty. The cedar boughs whisper like a choir of harps, the ground breathes with the cool of perpetual twilight, and the very breeze carries the incense of the gods. Here Humbaba waits, his face a tangle of entrails, his voice a hurricane that scatters the birds. The text records the hero's prayers to Shamus, the sun god, whose rising light alone can pierce the monstrous auras of the guardian. Modern discovery lends flesh to these poetic images. When Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam brought to light the Nineveh tablets in the mid-19th century, scholars first encountered the terror and splendor of Humbaba's realm. Subsequent geological surveys of the Lebanese highlands reveal pollen cores indicating dense cedar coverage during the 3rd millennium BCE, later thinned by millennia of royal exploitation. The myth preserves a memory of ecological reality, the irresistible lure of timber that built ziggurats and ships, and the divine dread that surrounded any attempt to seize it. In the Forbidden Forest, the epic locates a truth older than Uruk's bricks. Between the ordered city and the untouched mountain stands a line drawn by the gods, a reminder that human ambition, even when crowned with divine blood, must reckon with the sanctity of creation. The cedar trees rise as living pillars of that decree, and Humbaba, dread servant of Enlil, embodies the storm that guards it. To step beneath those branches is to challenge heaven itself, and the heroes advance into that perfumed darkness becomes not merely a quest for glory but a ritual breach, a deliberate crossing of the boundary where mortal will confronts the eternal law. The clash within the Cedar Forest arrives with the fury of a storm loosed from the mountains. Tablet V of the standard Babylonian epic, copied onto clay in the 7th century BCE and recovered from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, unfolds the confrontation in lines heavy with the scent of sap and the roar of unearthly winds. Humbaba, guardian of the divine timber, emerges from the gloom like a living tempest, his face a maze of entrails, his voice a thunder that shakes the cedar trunks. 7 auras of terror, the melamu that radiates from gods and chosen kings, whirl around him like walls of living flame. Gilgamesh calls upon Shamus, the sun god, whose arrows of light pierce the choking mists. Bronze axes fall in rhythm with divine thunder. Enkidu seizes the giant by the hair. The cedar boughs quiver as if creation itself resists. When the final blow descends, the guardian of Enlil staggers and the forest itself seems to cry out, its fragrance mingling with the sharp iron of blood. The severed head of Humbaba becomes a dreadful trophy, its features frozen in a grimace of astonishment and loss. The poem lingers on the moment when the heroes cut down the tallest cedar, stripping it for the gate of Enlil's temple. What began as a quest for renown thus becomes an act of desecration, a mortal challenge to the boundary between human ambition and the sanctity of the divine grove. The epic does not disguise the ambiguity. Gilgamesh and Enkidu win glory, but the killing of the appointed guardian invites the vengeance of the gods and foreshadows the sorrows that follow. Archaeological echoes of this narrative of violent justice appear in the cities of Mesopotamia itself. At Tel Harmal, ancient Shuruppak, excavated in the early 1940s, scholars uncovered law collections predating Hammurabi, tablets inscribed with judgments where execution by beheading served as the ultimate penalty for crimes against the divine order. Similarly, excavations at Tel Esma-Eshnunna, beginning in 1930, revealed votive statues with wide, imploring eyes placed before temple altars, many dedicated to deities of justice and storm. These sites testify that the severing of the head, whether of a criminal or a rival king, symbolized not only death, but the public restoration of cosmic balance. In striking Humbaba and bearing away his head, Gilgamesh and Enkidu enact a drama their own culture understood as both triumph and sacrilege. The felling of the cedar itself carries a resonance that transcends Mesopotamia. Across the ancient world, the sacred tree stands as axis of the cosmos, a meeting of underworld, earth, and sky. In the book of Genesis, composed between the 10th and 6th centuries BCE, the tree of knowledge rises at the center of Eden, its fruit forbidden yet desired, and the human grasping for it brings both wisdom and exile. Islamic tradition preserves a celestial counterpart in the Sidrat al-Muntaha, the lote tree of the furthest boundary described in the Prophet Muhammad's M.I.2BFR.A. Macron J. The night ascent to the highest heaven where creation meets the infinite mercy of God. To cross its branches is to enter a realm no mortal may endure. In the Iranian plateau, the Zoroastrian scriptures of the Avesta, redacted between the 6th century BCE and the Sasanian age, honor the Hayoma tree, source of the sacred drink that grants strength and immortality, its pressed sap a bridge between the worlds. The cedar of Humbaba belongs to this vast family of cosmic trees, its towering body both invitation and interdiction. For the Sumerians and Akkadians, the cedar's sanctity was tangible. Its incorruptible wood lined the palaces of kings and the kelly of temples. Its resin perfumed sacrifices to Ishtar and Enlil. Archaeobotanical studies of pollen cores from the Lebanese highlands confirm that these forests were far denser in the 3rd millennium BCE, before centuries of imperial logging thinned their canopy. Every trunk cut and hauled down the Euphrates to the ziggurats of Ur or the gates of Babylon carried with it the unspoken knowledge of transgression, the memory of a mountain once guarded by the gods. The epic's own theology underscores the cost of this violation. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu return bearing the cedar and the head, the divine council pronounces judgment. Enlil, who once appointed Humbaba as sentinel, rages at the affront. In the following tablet, the goddess Ishtar's proposal and Enkidu's death will complete the circle of consequence. Victory becomes omen, the scent of cedar clings like an accusation. To strike the sacred tree and to spill the blood of its guardian is to taste the fruit of knowledge, an ascent toward glory that is also a descent into mortality. When Austin Henry Layard's spades uncovered the buried library of Nineveh in 1849, and when George Smith first translated these tablets in 1872, modern readers encountered in Humbaba's fate a drama older than any single scripture yet familiar to all. The human desire to seize the eternal, to claim what is set apart. The severed head, paraded through Uruk, is more than a spoil of war. It is a mirror of the human heart that dares the forbidden, a relic of awe and guilt, and a sign that every triumph carved from the sacred carries the shadow of its own undoing. So the cedar stands forever in memory, its stump bleeding resin like incense, while the winds of Enlil sweep across the mountains, remembering the day when men laid low a living pillar of heaven. In the still heat of Uruk's courtyards, where the scent of cedar from the slain forest yet lingered, and the songs of triumph had scarcely faded, the goddess who rules both passion and battle descended with eyes of flame. Tablet VI of the standard Babylonian epic, copied onto clay tablets in the 7th century BCE, and unearthed from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in the mid-19th century, unfolds the encounter with a gravity that borders on terror. Ishtar, called Inanna in the older Sumerian hymns, approaches Gilgamesh in the radiance of divine beauty. Her voice is at once invitation and command. She offers him kingship that would stretch beyond Uruk's brick walls, a chariot of lapis lazuli pulled by storming lions, and a throne among the stars. To the Mesopotamian mind, such a proposal was no mortal dalliance, but a covenant of cosmic reach, for the sacred marriage of goddess and king renewed the very fertility of the land and confirmed the city's place beneath the heavens. Yet Gilgamesh answers with words of steel. He rejects her openly, and in his refusal, he recounts the litany of lovers who came to ruin under her gaze. He names Tammuz, the youthful shepherd god whose death each summer was mourned with wailing rites across the cities of Sumer and Akkad. He recalls the great bird of heaven, the lion, the horse, the shepherd, and the gardener Ishalanu, all who tasted her embrace only to be pierced by calamity. His speech is not the polite evasion of a wary king. It is an accusation hurled toward the divine. To spurn the goddess, who embodies both love and the red storm of war, is sacrilege, and the epic records the shock of the gods themselves at his defiance. The weight of this moment draws upon centuries of mythic memory. Long before the Akkadian tablets were pressed, the Sumerian cycle of Inanna's descent to the underworld, preserved on clay texts dating to 1900–1600 BCE and excavated at Nippur and told of the goddess who ventured into the realm of her dark sister Ereshkigal. Stripped of her garments and her divine powers at each of the 7 gates, Inanna passed beyond life and was hung upon a hook like carrion until the rites of resurrection restored her. That ancient drama reveals a deity whose essence is transformation through death and return, a sovereign of both eros and annihilation. Gilgamesh, fully aware of the peril bound within her love, refuses not merely a union, but the cycle of death that her embrace portends. Archaeology bears witness to the reach of her cult. Excavations at Eresh, traditionally identified with the sacred city of Inanna, have uncovered temple platforms and dedicatory plaques from the early dynastic period, c. 2600 BCE, their inscriptions invoking the goddess as Queen of Heaven and Earth. At Uruk, the Ina precinct, cleared in stages by German teams beginning in 1912, revealed successive layers of shrines, mosaic-faced walls, and thousands of votive offerings. Carved alabaster figures, ritual vessels, and cylinder seals depicting the goddess standing upon a lion, her star-crowned standard rising behind her. These remains testify that by the time of Gilgamesh, the cult of Ishtar/Inanna was woven into the very fabric of Mesopotamian civic and agricultural life. Her festivals regulated the calendar. Her priests and priestesses mediated fertility, kingship, and war. The ferocity of her response to Gilgamesh's rejection reflects the cosmic stakes. Tablet VI describes her ascent to the heavens of Anu, where she demands the bull of heaven to punish the mortal who has spurned her. The text lingers on her wrath, an elemental force that shakes the rivers and dries the fields, echoing the Sumerian belief that the goddess of desire is also the mistress of drought and battle. In this union of creative and destructive power, she resembles other great goddesses of the ancient world. Anat of Canaan, whose hymns of the late 2nd millennium BCE praise her as both virgin and slayer. Sekhmet of Egypt, lion-headed bringer of plague and healer of kings. And in later centuries, the Artemis of Ephesus, whose many-breasted image promised fertility while her arrows carried sudden death. Comparative religion deepens the resonance of Gilgamesh's defiance. In the Hebrew scriptures, the prophet Hosea speaks of Israel's unfaithfulness as adultery against the Lord, and the Song of Songs dares to clothe divine love in the language of human passion. In the Qur letter to be a Macron N, revealed in 7th century Arabia, the divine name Al-Rahman carries both maternal tenderness and sovereign majesty, reminding believers that mercy and awe are never parted. Gilgamesh's refusal, though framed in a polytheistic age, anticipates a later insistence on fidelity to a single, transcendent order beyond the enticements of fertility and war. Modern readers, when the tablets were first translated by George Smith in 1872, were struck by the fearless speech of the king who dared to accuse a goddess. Yet the ancients who first heard the tale would have recognized in his words not mere arrogance, but the unfolding of fate. To deny Ishtar was to invite a chain of events that neither mortal nor god could later unmake: the descent of the bull of heaven, the death of Enkidu, and the long journey toward wisdom that would strip Gilgamesh of pride. His rejection is therefore both crime and catalyst, the moment when human will confronts divine desire and sets the stage for a deeper encounter with mortality. The cry of Ishtar thus resounds across millennia, a summons of beauty and terror, of fecundity and ruin. In her we glimpse the power that ancient Mesopotamia revered and feared, the force that quickens the womb and topples the city. Gilgamesh's defiance, inscribed on clay and buried beneath the ruins of Nineveh until its 19th century discovery, remains one of the earliest and most audacious declarations of human autonomy in the face of cosmic passion, a refusal that will call down the heavens and draw the epic inexorably toward its tragedy and its truth. The wrath of the goddess did not linger in mere lament. From the high precinct of Anu, she demanded a weapon commensurate with the insult she had suffered, a force to strike not only the body of Gilgamesh, but the soil of his dominion. Tablet VI of the standard Babylonian epic, preserved in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh and copied around the 7th century BCE, recounts how Ishtar, trembling with rage, begged her father Anu to release the bull of heaven. Only such a creature, born of the celestial pastures and nourished on the mists of the upper sky, could avenge the slight to her divinity. Anu hesitated, for he knew that the bull's coming would open fissures in the earth and dry the rivers, but at last he consented, giving her the leish of the beast, whose breath is drought. When the bull descended, the clay of Sumer cracked like broken pottery. Dust rose in choking clouds as the creature's hooves struck the ground, rivers shrank to threads of silver, wells failed, and the people of Uruk stumbled in thirst. The epic records that with each snort the earth opened into chasms, swallowing hundreds at a time. Here myth and climate memory entwine. Geological studies of the Tigris, Euphrates Basin and cuneiform drought records speak of a severe arid event around 2200 BCE, the same period associated with the Akkadian collapse, when settlements from Mesopotamia to the Levant suffered famine and migration. Layers of windblown dust found at Tel Leilan and Tel Brak confirm a centuries-long desiccation that forced empires to their knees. The bull of heaven embodies this terror, the scorching breath of the sky that desolates the harvest and drives nations to ruin. The creature's celestial identity deepens the symbol. Ancient Mesopotamian astronomers, whose star lists and omen tablets guided kings and priests alike, recognized the constellation we now call Taurus as the heavenly bull, Gud. Anna. Spring's rising of this stellar sign marked the turning of the agricultural year and the swelling of the rivers. To summon the bull from the heavens was therefore to unhinge the cosmic calendar, to bring a season of fertility as a weapon of destruction. When Shamash, the sun god, aids Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the battle, the narrative mirrors the nightly struggle of sun against the zodiacal bull, a cosmic contest inscribed across the Mesopotamian sky. The slaying of the bull echoes and anticipates other sacred bovines that stride through the myths of later civilizations. In the Zoroastrian Bundahishan, a text compiled in Middle Persian during the early Islamic centuries, but preserving far older Avestan traditions, the primordial bull Gavivodata is killed by the evil spirit Ahriman, and from its lifeless body spring all beneficent animals and the first plants, a sacrifice that seeds creation itself. The Hebrew scriptures remember the golden calf of Exodus 32, an idol molded at Sinai, when the people turned from the unseen God to the tangible strength of a young bull, provoking divine anger and judgment. In each tradition, the bull is at once life-giver and rebel, a figure of cosmic potency whose death releases both blessing and curse. The archaeological record affirms the bull's preeminence in ancient cult. Excavations of the royal cemetery of 1922–1934 revealed lyres adorned with golden bull heads and inlaid lapis lazuli eyes, instruments placed in grave, as if the music of the bovine heavens might guide the dead. Cylinder seals from the Akkadian and Old Babylonian periods show celestial bulls trampling serpents or standing beneath the star of Ishtar, visual liturgies of power and fertility. In temples from Eshnunna to Mari, dedicatory plaques depict processions of sacred cattle, their horns wrapped in silver leaf, a ritual memory of the creature that unites Earth's abundance with the terror of the storm. Against this cosmic backdrop, the Battle of Gilgamesh and Enkidu takes on the gravity of a celestial drama. Enkidu seizes the bull by the horns, while Gilgamesh drives the fatal blow of his great bronze sword. The earth ceases its convulsion, but the act seals the hero's fate. The epic makes clear that the killing of a divine emissary demands recompense. Enkidu, who mocked the goddess and flung the bull's haunch toward her in scorn, will soon sicken and die. Their victory, like the felling of the Cedar Forest, is a transgression cloaked in glory. When the clay tablets of Nineveh were lifted from the mound of Kyanjik in 1849 by Austin Henry Layard, and later deciphered by George Smith in 1872, scholars marveled at the convergence of myth, astronomy, and history. Here was a narrative that remembered the droughts of the third millennium, charted the constellations of the spring sky, and anticipated the sacred bulls of Iran and Israel. The bull of heaven is therefore more than a monster of legend. It is the living memory of famine and starry omen, the embodiment of the sky's terrible sovereignty. Through the thunder of its hooves, the ancients heard both warning and revelation. The cracked earth of Sumer, the glittering horns of Taurus, the ritual bulls of temples and scriptures, all speak with one voice, that the forces which grant fertility can also withdraw it, and that human pride, whether in king or people, must reckon with the untamed will of the heavens. In the corpse of the celestial bull, lying upon the blood-soaked plain of Uruk, the epic inscribes the truth that creation and destruction are never far apart, and that every drought, every star, and every sacrifice is a sign of the same eternal law. The victory over the bull of heaven resounded through Uruk with the clamor of triumph, yet beneath the jubilation a darker summons stirred. In the hidden council of the great gods, Enlil raised his voice in judgment. The slaying of the divine creature and the insult flung against Ishtar could not pass unpunished. Tablet VII of the standard Babylonian epic, inscribed on clay in the 7th century BCE and recovered from the ruins of Nineveh by Austin Henry Layard in 1849, records the decree with the solemnity of an irrevocable verdict. One of the heroes must die. The assembly chose Enkidu, the clay-born companion who had dared to tear the haunch of the celestial bull and hurl it at the outraged goddess. Shamus, the radiant sun, pleaded in vain. Enkidu was marked for the long silence. The text lingers on his slow undoing. Fever grips him like a serpent's coil. Dreams of the netherworld crowd his nights. In those visions he sees the house of dust, where the dead drink clay and kings sit humbled beside their subjects. He beholds the judges of Anu and the priests of Enlil, now shades clad in feathers, and he trembles. His body, once powerful as the steppe itself, weakens until even Gilgamesh's embrace cannot warm it. The companionship that once defied gods and forests is powerless before the quiet decree of death. The lament that follows draws from a well of ritual older than empire. Mesopotamian literature abounds with dirges that mingle human grief with cosmic sorrow. The Sumerian lamentation over the destruction of Ur, composed around 2000 BCE, and the Akkadian city laments speak in the voices of goddesses who weep for their ruined sanctuaries, echoing the mourning of Inanna herself. In the descent of Inanna, preserved on tablets from Nipur dating, to 1900–1600 BCE. The goddess of love passes through the 7 gates of the underworld, is stripped of her regalia, and hangs lifeless until the rites of lamentation and substitution secure her release. These texts shaped the funerary imagination of the region. Death was not a private extinction, but a rupture in the fabric of cosmos, demanding communal wailing, offerings of food and drink, and the music of harps to soothe restless spirits. Archaeology gives the weight of earth to these ancient words. In the Royal Cemetery of excavated between 1922 and 1934 by Sir Leonard Woolley, archaeologists uncovered tombs of startling grandeur and pathos. Beneath vaults of brick lay the bodies of kings and queens attended by dozens of retainers who had drunk the final narcotic and lain down beside their sovereigns. Harps and lyres, adorned with golden bullheads, rested among them, their strings long vanished, but their sound imagined as accompaniment for the soul's passage. Shell inlays depicted banquet scenes, and vessels of silver and lapis suggested the offerings required to sustain the dead in the shadowed world. These discoveries mirror the epic's own portrayal of Enkidu's rites, where music, lamentation, and sacrifice intertwine to bridge the chasm between living and dead. The lament of Gilgamesh rises from this ritual ground. He casts aside his royal robes, letting dust and ashes cover his hair. He prowls the city walls like a lion robbed of its cub, crying out to the gods for mercy that will not come. His words echo the Sumerian Balag hymns, dirges performed with drums and harps to appease divine wrath, and the Akkadian Kinnu, where mourners chanted through the night to guide the departed. The epic describes artisans shaping a funerary statue of Enkidu from gold and precious stones, an image to hold the spirit and receive the daily offerings of bread, beer, and incense. Such effigies, known from administrative texts at and Mari, allowed the dead to remain present within the household and the temple, participating in the ongoing covenant of memory. Comparative traditions cast additional light upon this scene of grief. In the Hebrew scriptures, the lament of David over Jonathan, 2 Samuel 1, bears the same cadence of royal friendship shattered by death, a song of love surpassing the love of women. In Greek tragedy, Achilles mourns Patroclus with hair shorn and ashes heaped upon his head before returning to battle and destiny. Islamic tradition remembers the Prophet Muhammad standing in silent tears at the grave of his infant son Ibrahim, affirming that the eye weeps and the heart grieves, but we say only what pleases the Lord. Across these cultures, the mourning of the beloved becomes a rite where human sorrow touches the eternal. Enkidu's death is more than the loss of a friend. It is the pivot of the epic's theology. Through this grief, Gilgamesh confronts the immutable decree that even the mighty must fall. The cedar gates hewn in triumph now stand as silent witnesses to the brevity of human glory. The journey that will follow through deserts, mountains, and the dark waters of death begins in the chamber where the wild twin lies still. In the cadence of his lament, in the offerings of bread and beer placed before the golden effigy, the king of Uruk learns the lesson that no wall of brick or cedar can outlast the destiny written on the tablets of heaven. When the buried library of Nineveh yielded these lines to the modern world in the 19th century, scholars recognized in them one of humanity's oldest meditations on mortality. The funeral of Enkidu, echoing the laments of Inanna and the sacrificial grave of preserves the Mesopotamian conviction that death is a passage requiring music, offering, and the tears of both gods and men. Through that ancient sorrow, the epic speaks still, that every bond, however sacred, must one day be tested in the house of dust, and that the mourning of the gods is also the mourning of us all. The king of Uruk, once radiant in lapis and gold, emerges from the chamber of lament, clothed only in grief. Tablet IX of the standard Babylonian epic, inscribed on clay tablets of the 7th century BCE and unearthed in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, opens with a vision of Gilgamesh transformed. His royal diadem is gone, his hair falls in matted locks, and over his body he wraps the hide of a lion, a rough garment of the wilderness. The man who once strode the cedar forests in the pride of conquest now moves like a hunter of shadows, wandering the steppes where wind scours the plain and the stars burn without mercy. His friend Enkidu lies silent in the house of dust, and the terror of mortality drives him toward the only name whispered to have escaped death, Utnapishtim, survivor of the primordial flood. The cloak of skin carries the weight of ancient symbol. In Mesopotamian ritual, the lion pelt marked both ferocity and divine sanction, worn by heroes and by the warrior god Nineveh in hymns from the 3rd millennium BCE. Yet the image also speaks across cultures. In the book of Genesis 3:21, after the first humans taste the forbidden fruit, the Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them, a sign of protection, but also of exile, the mortal covering that follows the loss of Eden. Early Christian teachers read those skins as the mark of humanity's fallen condition. Jewish mystics saw in them a veil between flesh and spirit. So too does Gilgamesh's lion hide proclaim both strength and the naked vulnerability of a man newly aware that he will die. His journey eastward begins as an act of ascetic renunciation. Leaving behind the walled gardens of Uruk, he enters landscapes that the ancients imagined as the threshold between life and death. Mesopotamian geography and poetic memory place his path toward the rising sun, into the harsh ranges that later scribes associated with Mount Mashu. Scholars identify this mythical barrier with the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, where jagged limestone ridges and deep gorges stand like the very teeth of the earth. Texts describe twin peaks whose tops touch the heavens and whose roots reach the underworld, guarded by scorpion beings whose glance is death to mortals. Here the hero must pass through a tunnel of 12 double hours darkness before he may see the garden of the gods. The march from city to mountain evokes the pattern of the solitary seeker found throughout the ancient Near East. In Mesopotamian devotion, priests withdrew to deserts for purification before great festivals. Sumerian hymns speak of kings who fasted in the wilderness to receive omens. Centuries later, Christian anchorites such as Antony of Egypt, 3rd–4th century CE, would retreat to the arid wastes of the Nile to battle demons and encounter the divine in silence. Islamic tradition remembers the Prophet Muhammad seeking the solitude of Letawani 25 IR a Macron letter 2be cave before the first revelation of the Qur letter 2be a Macron n. Across these traditions, the wilderness is both testing ground and holy sanctuary, a place where the seeker confronts the limits of flesh and the hidden face of God. Archaeological memory supports the epic's stark imagery. Excavations along the ancient caravan routes east of Mesopotamia, at sites such as Susa and Anshan, centers of Elamite civilization, have revealed way stations and shrines dating to the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, where travelers left offerings before venturing into the treacherous passes of the Zagros. These mountains, their peaks often veiled in storm, formed the natural boundary of the Mesopotamian world. To cross them was to enter a realm of spirits and unknown gods, a journey mirrored in the mythic topography of Gilgamesh's quest. The hero's mind is fixed on Utnapishtim, the one granted immortality after the flood, remembered in both the Atrahasis epic of the 18th century BCE and the biblical narrative of Noah. Gilgamesh hopes that by finding him, he might seize the secret of endless life. Yet the lion's skin and the road of stone already proclaim the deeper lesson, that the path toward eternity begins with the stripping away of earthly glory. As he wanders, he no longer speaks as king, but as penitent, his words filled with the cadence of lament psalms and Akkadian dirges, calling to the winds, "Shall I not die like Enkidu? Sorrow has entered my heart." Modern discovery of these lines, first read by George Smith in 1872 from the tablets of Nineveh, revealed to a later age one of humanity's earliest portraits of existential dread. The lion-clad king, walking alone beneath an unpitying sky, embodies the universal recognition that no fortress of brick, no cedar gate, no victory over monster or goddess can avert the common fate. His pilgrimage through the mountains toward the edge of the world is the ancient precursor of every seeker who leaves the city of men to confront the silence of death and the possibility of what lies beyond. Thus, the cloak of skin is more than mere covering. It is the garment of exile and the mantle of the pilgrim, the sign that Gilgamesh has stepped beyond the pride of kings into the raw estate of mortal man. Eastward he walks, toward Mount Mashu and the Black Tunnel where sun and moon are swallowed, driven by the fear that has shaped every human heart, that the breath will cease, the body return to clay, and only the name, if the gods are merciful, endure upon the imperishable tablets of time. The eastern horizon of myth rises before Gilgamesh as a wall of living flame. Beyond the stony wilderness, the mountains called Mashu lift their twin peaks into the vault of the sky, their roots plunging into the abyss where the rivers of the underworld coil in silence. Tablet IX of the standard Babylonian epic, copied in the 7th century BCE and drawn from earlier Sumerian sources, describes this boundary as the very hinge of creation, where the sun itself enters and departs the world of men. At its gate stand the dread guardians known as the Akrabu Amilu, the scorpion men, beings whose upper bodies gleam with the armor of celestial warriors, while their lower halves curve into the barbed tails of the desert's fiercest creature. Their sight, says the text, is death, for the gaze of such intermediaries burns with the first light of dawn and the last fire of dusk. The appearance of these sentinels draws upon the deep iconography of Mesopotamia. Cylinder seals of the Old Babylonian period, c. 1800 BCE, depict hybrid figures with human torsos and scorpion claws, often flanking a solar disk or a stylized mountain. Assyrian palace reliefs from Nimrud and Nineveh, carved in the 9th–7th centuries BCE, show similar guardian spirits, part man, part creature of venom, stationed at gateways and temple thresholds. These were not mere decorations, but apotropaic beings, embodiments of the liminal power that wards the holy precinct from profane intrusion. Their very bodies signify duality, the human striving upward, the scorpion rooted in the poisonous dust, together forming a living emblem of the frontier between death and life. The epic tells how Gilgamesh, shrouded in the lion's skin of mourning, approaches these radiant terrors. The scorpion man speaks first, his voice as deep as the clap of thunder, demanding to know why a mortal dares the path of the sun. Gilgamesh recounts his grief for Enkidu and his quest for Utnapishtim, and the guardian, discerning the stamp of divine blood, grants him passage. The woman guardian, whose eyes gleam with the crimson of twilight, warns that the road within is a tunnel of 12 double hours where no light of moon or star can reach, the very passage by which the sun travels under the earth each night. So begins the hero's long march through the darkness, a journey of silence broken only by the beating of his own heart. The Scorpion men belong to a wider family of threshold keepers in the religions of the ancient world. Zoroastrian scripture speaks of the Devas, demonic adversaries who guard the Chinvat bridge, the perilous crossing of souls after death. Their forms, half luminous and half monstrous, challenge the traveler who would reach the house of song. In later Islamic cosmology, the Qur letter 2b a macron n describes angels set over the blazing gate of Jahannam and others who stand at the Sidrat al-Muntaha, the lote tree of the furthest boundary, where the prophet encountered the angelic host on his night ascent. Though separated by centuries and belief, these figures share a single function: to test the mortal who seeks the realm of the divine, to guard the interface of worlds with a gaze that judges the heart. Astronomical knowledge underlies the myth. Mesopotamian star priests mapped the sky with meticulous care, and the path of the sun through the zodiac was recorded in the Mul, Apin tablets of the first millennium BCE. The description of a 12-double-hour tunnel almost certainly reflects the sun's nightly journey beneath the horizon, a poetic rendering of the underworld passage from west to east. Scholars have noted that the entrance at Mashu aligns with the winter solstice, when the sun's rising seems to pause and the days begin to lengthen, a moment of cosmic renewal and dread. The Scorpion, too, belongs to the heavens. The constellation Scorpius, with its fiery red heart in the star Antares, marked the autumn setting of the sun and signaled the turning toward winter's darkness. The guardians of Gilgamesh thus embody both stellar and spiritual thresholds. Archaeological discoveries illuminate the cultic resonance of such cosmic gates. Excavations at Shuruppak, Khorsabad, and Nineveh, carried out in the 19th century by Paul Emile Botta and Austin Henry Layard, revealed colossal lamashu, winged bulls with human heads, stationed at palace portals to repel chaos. Though differing in form from the Scorpion men, these colossi express the same conviction, that the limen between realms demands living symbols of power, hybrid beings who embody the union of heaven and earth. Earlier still, terracotta plaques from Mari, c. 1800 BCE, depict monstrous guardians beside stylized mountain gates, visual echoes of the very scene through which Gilgamesh must pass. As he walks the endless corridor of night, Gilgamesh moves beyond the reckoning of kings. Each double hour brings a deeper silence, until the dark itself seems to press upon his skin like a second hide. At last he glimpses a dim horizon and the garden of the gods where jeweled trees shimmer in perpetual dawn. The passage through Mashu is therefore more than a geographic feat, it is initiation. Stripped of companions, guided only by the courage born of grief, he traverses the cosmic death that every soul must face. The Scorpion men, far from mere monsters, are hierophants of this mystery, granting entry only to the one who has accepted the inevitability of the grave. When these tablets emerged from the mounds of Kyanjik in the mid-19th century and were first read by George Smith in 1872, modern scholars recognized in the Scorpion men a vision of the ancient world's most profound threshold, the gate where day surrenders to night and mortal flesh approaches the eternal. Their shining stings and human eyes remain a potent emblem of the perilous boundary that all must cross, whether at death, at solstice, or in the solitary quest for immortality. Through their watchful gaze, the epic teaches that the road to everlasting life is guarded not by walls of stone, but by mysteries of heaven and darkness that no king may bypass, save by courage and the permission of the gods. Emerging from the 12-fold darkness of Mount Mashu, Gilgamesh steps into a light that is neither dawn nor sunset, a radiance untouched by the hours of men. Tablet IX of the standard Babylonian epic, inscribed on the clay tablets of the 7th century BCE and recovered from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, names this place the Garden of the Gods, a realm where the earth itself is transfigured. Before him rise trees whose trunks gleam with precious metals, whose leaves are of lapis lazuli, whose fruit is of carnelian and agate. The very gravel beneath his feet sparkles with gems. A breeze heavy with cedar and myrrh flows through branches that bear neither decay nor shadow. Here no bird cries, no beast prowls, only the silent pulse of immortality. After the long corridor of blackness, the brilliance overwhelms him. He is a mortal trespasser in a precinct where matter has become light. This jeweled orchard is more than poetic fancy. Mesopotamian imagination long envisioned divine realms as fertile enclosures, places where precious stones and luxuriant flora coexist. Tablets from Babylon and Borsippa, dating to the 1st millennium BCE, describe temple gardens filled with rare plants, watered by hidden channels and ornamented with gold. Even earlier, Hittite texts from Hattusa, c. 14th century BCE, speak of sacred parks dedicated to the goddess Hepat, where trees dripped with silver leaves and rites of renewal were performed at the turning of the year. Archaeologists excavating palace complexes at Nimrud and Khorsabad have uncovered carved reliefs of winged spirits tending stylized trees whose flowers are rosettes of gold, visual hymns to a paradise that mingled the mineral and the organic. The garden encountered by Gilgamesh stands within this long tradition of sacred horticulture, an eternal orchard where divine abundance is expressed in stone that lives. The resonance of this scene extends far beyond the Tigris and Euphrates. In the Book of Genesis, compiled between the 10th and 6th centuries BCE, the Garden of Eden is planted eastward, watered by 4 rivers, and adorned with every tree pleasant to the sight and good for food. Its center holds the tree of life, whose fruit would grant immortality, an image uncannily close to the gem-laden grove that greets the weary king. In the Qur letter 2b, a macron n, revealed in the 7th century CE, the faithful are promised Jannah, gardens beneath which rivers flow, where couches are inlaid with gold and fruits hang in perpetual season, a paradise whose very name means enclosure. The ancient Persian paradisa, a royal walled garden from which the Greek word predates and the English paradise descend, offers another mirror. Inscriptions of the Achaemenid kings in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE celebrate these enclosed parks as earthly reflections of heavenly order, stocked with rare trees and fragrant waters to display the bounty of Ahura Mazda. The jeweled trees themselves carry an even older symbolism. In Sumerian hymns, the Shuruppak tree stood at the threshold of the sacred river, guarded by spirits and destined to become the throne and bed of Inanna. Babylonian incantations speak of the tree of bright stone in the depths of the cosmic sea. Such imagery fuses mineral and vegetal to express the eternal. Stone that grows, wood that does not wither, life unending. To walk among these trees is to step outside the cycles of decay, to glimpse a creation before the fall and beyond the grave. Gilgamesh wanders through this shining orchard in awe, yet he does not pluck its fruit. The text offers no hint of hunger or theft. His quest is not for jewels, but for the secret of unending life. The garden is a vestibule, not the goal. Its silence speaks a caution older than law, Immortality is not seized by hand, but bestowed by the gods. Here the epic anticipates the later wisdom of Israel's sages, who taught that the tree of life is guarded by flaming swords, and of the Qur'an a macron ns vision, where paradise is granted only to those whom God admits. Modern scholarship finds in this episode a convergence of myth, art, and ancient horticulture. Excavations at Pasargadae in Iran, capital of Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, reveal the earliest known example of the formal Persian garden, rectilinear plots divided by running water, perhaps itself inspired by Mesopotamian prototypes. Cuneiform administrative tablets from Mari, c. 18th century BCE, list shipments of exotic fruit trees and perfumed woods for palace plantations, a royal attempt to recreate on earth the abundance sung of in celestial gardens. These earthly paradises were but shadows of the immortal orchard that Gilgamesh now beholds. Yet the hero's heart remains restless. For all its brilliance, the garden offers no answer to the riddle of death. Beyond its shining boughs lies the edge of the cosmic sea and the ferryman Urshanabi, who alone can guide him to Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the flood. The garden of the gods thus serves as both revelation and threshold, a vision of the eternal to quicken his longing, and a reminder that the gift he seeks cannot be wrested from nature's beauty, but must be granted by the will of heaven. When these lines were first deciphered from the tablets of Nineveh by George Smith in 1872, readers across the modern world recognized in them the archetype of paradise that lives in every faith. From the jeweled trees of Gilgamesh to the Eden of Genesis, from the Persian paradisa to the Qur'an a macron nic Jannah, the human heart has never ceased to imagine a garden beyond death where time stands still and life is forever renewed. In that luminous orchard, glittering with stones that grow like fruit, Gilgamesh walks as the first pilgrim of all who yearn for an undying home. Tablet XI of the standard Babylonian epic, inscribed on clay in the 7th century BCE and recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, opens upon the voice of one who has crossed the boundary of death. Gilgamesh, spent from his journey through the jeweled garden and the waters of death, stands before Utnapishtim, the faraway man whom the gods alone have granted everlasting life. To the grief-stricken king, the survivor of the primeval cataclysm recounts a memory older than empires, the story of the deluge that once swept over the lands of Sumer, Akkad, and the mountains beyond. Utnapishtim speaks of a time when the clamor of humankind grew so loud that it disturbed the sleep of the high gods. Enlil, lord of wind and destiny, resolved to silence the earth with waters that would swallow cities and fields alike. Only Enki, the wise god of the deep, whispered the secret to his faithful servant, bidding him to tear down his house and build a great boat. The epic lingers on the dimensions, a vessel square as the cosmic order, its length and breadth equal, 6 decks high, sealed with pitch inside and out. Into it he brought the seed of all living things, his kin and craftsmen, and beasts of the field in pairs, until the appointed storm rose from the horizon. For 6 days and 7 nights the tempests raged, the rivers lifted their voices, and the Anunnaki themselves trembled as the sea covered the mountains. On the 7th day the wind grew calm, and Utnapishtim's ship came to rest upon Mount Nimush, its keel wedged in the stones as the first light of renewal broke across the waters. This testimony does not stand alone. It descends from a lineage of flood narratives that reach back to the earliest written memory of Mesopotamia. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on old Babylonian tablets of the 18th century BCE, tells of the hero Atrahasis who, warned by Enki, survives a deluge sent to curb the noise of mankind. Older still, the Sumerian tale of Ziusudra, copied on tablets from Nippur and dated to around 1700 BCE, celebrates a pious king who preserves the seed of life in a great boat and receives immortality from an Enlil. These accounts share the same essential pattern later echoed in the Hebrew Genesis 6:9, where Noah fashions an ark of gopher wood, and in the Qur letter 2b a macron NIC narrative of Nu macron letter 1e25, 11:36-48, in which the prophet warns a heedless people before the waters rise. Across languages and millennia, the flood stands as a cosmic resetting, a judgment upon pride, and a covenant of renewal. Archaeology lends the texture of earth to these words of clay. Excavations at Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah, the city named as Utnapishtim's home, have revealed a thick stratum of riverine silt, up to 2 meters deep, dating to around 2900 BCE. Similar flood deposits appear at Kish, and Lagash, each marking a sudden inundation that interrupted early urban life. While no single layer can be claimed as the deluge of legend, these findings confirm that immense floods swept the Mesopotamian plain at the dawn of recorded history, leaving memories potent enough to be recited for 2,000 years. The imagery of Utnapishtim's ark reverberates beyond Mesopotamia. Egyptian tomb paintings of the Old Kingdom, c. 2500 BCE, show solar barks carrying the dead across celestial waters. Vedic hymns speak of Manu, the first man, saved from a world-engulfing flood by the god Vishnu in the form of a fish. Scholars have long noted that these traditions, while independent, draw upon a shared memory of rivers that overflowed their banks and seas that seemed to swallow the horizon. The Mesopotamian plain, poised between the Tigris and Euphrates, was especially vulnerable to such cataclysms, and its scribes, the first keepers of written history, transformed these disasters into theology. Utnapishtim's account, though clothed in mythic grandeur, bears the sober cadence of witness. He speaks of birds sent forth to test the waters, the dove, the swallow, the raven, long before the writer of Genesis set quill to parchment. He describes the offering made when the waters receded, a sacrifice whose smoke the gods gathered like flies, a phrase preserved almost verbatim in the old Babylonian Atrahasis and echoed in the pleasing aroma of Noah's altar. From this sacrifice, the gods, chastened by their own violence, swore never again to destroy all life and bestowed upon Utnapishtim and his wife a life beyond death, at the mouth of the rivers, a place beyond the reach of mortals. For Gilgamesh, the tale is both revelation and rebuke. He has sought the secret of immortality, yet Utnapishtim insists that life without death is a gift singular and unrepeatable. When the gods created mankind, death they allotted to men, but life they retained in their own keeping, the tablet proclaims. No wall of Uruk, no cedar beam, no heroic feat can undo this decree. The flood survivor, seated in tranquil eternity, becomes the mirror in which the restless king must see the futility of his quest. When the buried tablets of Nineveh came again to light in the 19th century, first deciphered by George Smith in 1872, the modern world heard in Utnapishtim's words the resonance of its own scriptures. Scholars and believers alike recognize the kinship with the story of Noah, the echo of an event that shaped the collective memory of the ancient Near East. Through this encounter, the Epic of Gilgamesh bridges the earlier civilizations and the later faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, affirming that beneath differing names, Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, Noah, Nu Macron Letawani 25, the tale of the waters is one. Thus in the house at the edge of the world, amid the whisper of eternal rivers, Utnapishtim recounts the deluge that remade heaven and earth. His voice, carried across 4,000 years of clay and ruin, tells Gilgamesh, and all who listen, that the flood is both history and parable, a memory of real disaster and a testament to the unalterable truth that life is a gift, death the boundary, and immortality a grace that cannot be won by strength of arm, but only bestowed by the inscrutable will of the gods. Utnapishtim continues his remembrance of the deluge, his voice etched into the clay of tablet Xi, copied in the 7th century BCE and recovered from the buried library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. After the furious tempest and the black waters that raged for 6 days and 7 nights, he tells how silence fell upon the world. The sea grew calm like polished lapis, every land lay beneath a shroud of silt. Then as the first pale light returned, the great boat, its decks sixfold, its walls sealed with bitumen, ground to a sudden halt upon a hidden peak. The narrative names this resting place Mount Nisia, though later scribes would speak of the twin peaks of Ararat or the solitary height of Judi Dog above the Tigris. Whatever its earthly name, the mountain stands in the epic as the immutable axis where the fury of the deep meets the stillness of heaven. Days passed as the waters receded. Utnapishtim opened a hatch and sent forth a dove, but finding no dry ground it circled back to the ship. He loosed a swallow, and again the bird returned. At last he released a raven, and when it failed to return he knew the earth had given back its face. These simple acts, preserved line by line in Akkadian cuneiform, became the pattern for later scriptures. In the book of Genesis 8:6-12, Noah dispatches a raven and a dove to test the flood's retreat, a detail whose striking precision astonished 19th century scholars when they first compared the tablets with the Hebrew text. The Qur letter to be a Macron ns Surat Hud 11:36-48 likewise speaks of a vessel that comes to rest upon the mountain Al-Judi, while birds and signs mark the waning of the waters. Across languages and centuries, the sending of the birds endures as the emblem of patient hope after cosmic ruin. Archaeology lends the story a quiet solidity. At Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah, long identified as Utnapishtim's home, excavators uncovered a broad layer of riverine silt dated to about 2900 BCE, a deposit matching similar flood strata at and Kish. Though no single layer can claim the whole myth, these sediments testify to an immense inundation whose memory could well seed a legend of worldwide destruction. Far to the north, the volcanic mass of Mount Ararat, where Armenian tradition locates the ark's resting place, bears perennial snowfields visible for leagues, a natural beacon for any survivor drifting on the receding seas. Whether the vessel grounded on Nisia in the Zagros or on Ararat in the Armenian highlands, the mountain's symbolic power is the same, a pillar of stone rising from chaos, the first stable earth after the unmaking of the world. The mountain in ancient thought is always more than geography. Sumerian hymns praise the Kur, the cosmic mountain that joins the underworld to the heavens, dwelling of the gods and seat of destiny. Ugaritic texts from Ras Shamra, 13th century BCE, describe Mount Letawani 6-3 Apo Macron N as the palace of Baal, the storm lord who governs fertility and rain. Later Hebrew poets would sing of Sinai wrapped in thunder and of Zion as the mountain of the great king. In Islamic tradition, the letter 2 a Macron J of the Prophet passes by the Sidrat al-Muntaha, the lote tree at the furthest boundary, another height where mortal realm and divine command meet. Utnapishtim's peak belongs to this sacred lineage, the place where destruction ends and covenant begins. When Utnapishtim steps onto the newly revealed land, he builds an altar of fragrant wood and offers sacrifice. The epic tells how the gods gathered like flies over the sweet savor, a vivid phrase already present in the older Atrahasis tablets of the 18th century BCE and echoed in the Genesis account where the Lord smells the pleasing aroma. The sacrifice signals not merely gratitude but cosmic reconciliation. Enlil, whose fury had summoned the waters, is pacified. Enki's wisdom is vindicated. The divine council swears never again to drown all living things. From this covenant, Utnapishtim and his wife receive the singular gift of immortality, dwelling forever at the mouth of the rivers, beyond the reach of death. The modern world first heard this story in 1872, when George Smith, working among the baked fragments from Nineveh in the reading room of the British Museum, pieced together the flood narrative and read it aloud to the Society of Biblical Archaeology. The discovery stunned Victorian England, for here was a deluge text older than Moses, inscribed more than a millennium before the Hebrew Bible, yet mirroring its details with uncanny precision. The cubic ark, the birds, the mountain, the covenantal sacrifice. Newspapers carried the revelation across Europe and America, and debates over scripture and history flared with new intensity. What had seemed the unique revelation of Genesis now stood revealed as part of a far more ancient chorus. For Gilgamesh, standing before the immortal man, the tale is at once marvel and reproach. The mountain that once bore the ark is beyond his reach, and the gods who spared Utnapishtim will not grant a second exemption. Life they retained in their own keeping, the survivor tells him, a truth older than any flood. Yet the image endures, a solitary peak rising from endless waters, a bird in flight carrying the promise of dry land. It is the emblem of survival, of covenant, and of the fragile mercy that binds heaven and earth after the world has drowned. The immortal Utnapishtim, seated beside the hidden waters where the Tigris meets the cosmic sea, regards the weary king with the calm of one who has crossed beyond time. After the tale of the flood, Gilgamesh pleads for the secret by which a man might escape the tomb. But the survivor of the deluge answers with words heavier than stone. When the gods created mankind, they allotted death to men and kept life for themselves. No feat of strength, no cedar wall, no conquest of monster or goddess can undo that primal decree. His speech carries the cadence of the oldest Mesopotamian theology, echoing the Atrahasis epic of the 18th century BCE, where the clamor of humanity leads the divine council to fix mortality as the boundary of the human estate. Death, in this vision, is not punishment alone, but a necessary measure, the seal that preserves the balance between earth and heaven. Yet compassion stirs in the heart of the deathless man. Utnapishtim discloses a hidden marvel. In the deep channels of the Abzu grows a thorny plant whose sap restores the strength of youth, known in Akkadian as Shamu Shiasi, the plant of heartbeat. If Gilgamesh can seize it, he may renew his life, though not escape the end. With stones tied to his feet, he plunges into the abyss, cuts the plant, and rises triumphant, already imagining how he will share its power with the elders of Uruk. But on the weary journey home, he stops to bathe in a cool spring, and while he rests, a serpent scents the sweetness of the plant and steals it away. Slipping from his grasp, the creature sheds its skin and glides into the reeds, leaving behind only the empty husk of promise. The hero sits in silence, tears cutting channels through the dust on his face, as the tablets record his lament. The labor of his hands has turned to nothing, and the earth itself has reminded him of his destiny. This fleeting encounter with the ungraspable echoes the oldest memories of humanity's lost paradise. In the book of Genesis 3:22-24, after the first pair has eaten of the tree of knowledge, the Lord God bars the way to the tree of life, lest they take also of it and live forever, placing the cherubim and a flaming sword to guard the path. The Qur letter 2b, a macron and likewise, recounts how Adam and a letter 2b are sent from the garden to dwell upon the earth until their appointed term, a mercy and a trial that leads ultimately to forgiveness, but not to endless life, Q2 35-39. The pattern is the same. The human longing for eternity meets the divine decree that mortality is the truest gift, the limit within which meaning and virtue are forged. The serpent that robs Gilgamesh of his prize deepens the resonance. Across cultures, the snake embodies both loss and renewal. In Genesis, it is the tempter whose cunning leads to exile, yet its ability to shed its skin made it an emblem of rebirth for Greeks and Egyptians alike. The Egyptian myth of Osiris, first inscribed in the pyramid texts of the 24th century BCE, tells of a god who is slain, scattered, and restored, offering to mortals not escape from death, but participation in a cycle of dying and rising. To the Mesopotamian mind, the serpent's theft is no random mischance. It is the earth reclaiming what the gods have decreed cannot belong to man, a living sign that renewal belongs to nature, not to individual flesh. Archaeological discoveries give the theological vision a ground of history. Funerary texts from and Nippur, dating as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, speak of the Kaisel Lil, the land of no return, where the dead drink dust and kings sit beside commoners. Offerings of bread and beer, recovered from tombs in the Royal Cemetery of excavated 1922-1934 by Leonard Woolley, show a culture resigned to death yet determined to honor the departed with continual sustenance. Death was not a failure to be overcome, but a passage to be ritually acknowledged, a covenant between the mortal and the divine. For Gilgamesh, the loss of the plant is not mere frustration, but the turning point of wisdom. He returns at last to Uruk, not with the elixir of life, but with a new understanding of what endures. The final tablet of the epic bids the reader to gaze upon the city's mighty walls, the work of human hands that outlasts the builder. His journey through forests, mountains, and oceans has not defeated death, but it has revealed that meaning lies not in endless days, but in the justice, beauty, and memory secured within the span allotted. In this insight, he joins the great chorus of later faiths, the psalmists of Israel who sang that the days of our years are 70, the sages of Islam who speak of the world as a trust to be returned, and the Christian mystics who see in death the narrow gate to life eternal. When the buried tablets of Nineveh were first deciphered by George Smith in 1872, Victorian readers heard in this ending a wisdom at once older and more profound than their own. The epic, far from promising escape, proclaims mortality as sacred gift, a decree as immovable as the mountains that once bore Utnapishtim's ark. The plant of life slips always from the grasping hand, the serpent forever renews its skin, and humanity, clothed in the cloak of death, discovers the only immortality permitted, the enduring memory of deeds, the city built, the name inscribed on the imperishable clay of time. The long road of exile ends beside the quiet waters from which it began. Having crossed mountains and seas to the farthest edge of the world, Gilgamesh turns his steps homeward, carrying the single hope wrested from the abyss, a thorned plant hidden in the deep, whose sap, Utnapishtim had said, could renew the strength of youth. Tablet XI of the standard Babylonian recension, inscribed in the 7th century BCE and recovered from the ruins of Nineveh, lingers over this fragile triumph. The king of Uruk, wrapped still in the lion's skin of mourning, imagines the joy of his elders when he presents the plant, the old made young, the city restored to vigor, the shadow of death delayed. Yet even as he dreams, the earth prepares its quiet answer. On the journey back, he pauses beside a cool spring where the river fans into reeds. Weary from the desert's glare, he sets the plant down and descends into the water. As he bathes, a serpent, drawn by the sweet scent, rises from the depths and seizes the treasure. The creature sloughs its skin as it departs, leaving the empty husk upon the stones while the living body glides into the current. When Gilgamesh emerges and beholds the loss, he sinks to the ground, tears streaking the dust of his face, and utters a lament older than any king. For whom, oh, for whom have I labored? For whom is the blood of my heart spent? The river flows on, indifferent, bearing the secret of renewal back into the hidden places of the world. The serpent that steals immortality coils through the myths of many nations. In the book of Genesis 3:1-24, the snake lures the first humans to transgress the divine command, and the tree of life is barred to them forever. In the Avesta of ancient Persia, the primordial serpent Ajidahaka embodies chaos and death, opposed by the luminous Ahura Mazda, yet destined to shed its form in the world's final renewal. Hindu tradition remembers the Nagas, serpents of the underworld and guardians of hidden jewels and elixirs. In the Mahabharata and Pura Macron letter 1E47 IC Thales, their sloughing skins symbolize eternal rejuvenation, the very power that slips from Gilgamesh's grasp. Across these traditions, the serpent stands both for death's inevitability and for the mysterious vitality that belongs only to the cycles of nature, never to the grasp of men. The setting of water is no accident. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the Abzu, the subterranean ocean of fresh waters, is the womb of life and the dwelling of the god E/Enki. To bathe there is to touch the primal source, but also to risk its claiming power. Archaeological excavations at and Eridu, cities sacred to Enki, reveal temple pools and channels used for ritual lustration, reminders that water both cleanses and carries away. The river that steals the plant recalls the flood that once drowned the world. The same element that preserves life also erases it, returning all things to the deep from which they came. The serpent's theft is not mere mischance, but the completion of a divine decree. The Atrahasis' epic, 18th century BCE, records that when the gods fixed death for mankind, they did so to keep the earth in balance, sparing it from the noise and violence of endless generations. The plant of rejuvenation may appear for a moment, but it cannot remain in mortal hands. Its loss restores the cosmic order that Gilgamesh's grief had sought to overturn. The hero who once cut down the cedars and slew the bull of heaven now stands silent before a law more ancient than kingship, that the rhythms of birth and decay belong to the gods alone. Yet the serpent's shedding carries a subtler meaning. By casting off its skin, the creature renews itself, displaying the very immortality denied to man. Egyptian texts of the Pyramid Age, c. 24th century BCE, praised the serpent Mehen as the eternal guardian who encircles the sun god in nightly rebirth. Greek temples later venerated the snake as a sign of healing and regeneration, twinning it about the staff of Asclepius. The Epic of Gilgamesh draws upon this shared symbolism to proclaim that nature itself, through the endless renewal of species and seasons, partakes of a life beyond the individual, a continuity in which the mortal may share only through memory and lineage. When the buried tablets of Nineveh were first translated by George Smith in 1872, Victorian readers recognized in this episode a profound kinship with their own scriptures. The plant lost to the serpent recalled the bard Eden, the flowing river suggested baptism and the washing away of earthly striving. For scholars and believers alike, the story revealed an ancient intuition that death, far from being a curse alone, is the very gift that gives weight to love, courage, and the works of human hands. Thus the river carries the flower of youth back to the unseen depths, and the serpent glides where no sword can follow. Gilgamesh rises from the waters empty-handed, yet strangely ennobled. He will return to Uruk not as the conqueror who sought eternal life, but as the king who has learned that all flesh is grass, and that only the name, the deed, and the city endure. The current that stole his prize has given him a deeper treasure, the knowledge that mortality itself is the seal of the divine, the quiet law by which earth and heaven remain in harmony. The king who once crossed oceans and mountains returns at last to the place from which his longing began. Tablet XII of the standard Babylonian epic, preserved on the clay tablets unearthed from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh in the 19th century, brings Gilgamesh back to the threshold of Uruk, no longer the restless seeker of immortality, but a man who has measured the breadth of the world and found its unalterable law. At the gate of his city he halts, gazing upon the vast ramparts that rise like a second horizon, walls of kiln-fired brick, joints sealed with bitumen, glowing red beneath the western sun. These are the very works he once commanded into being, the tangible witness of human hands defying the erasure of time. To the companion now lost, he speaks as to the generations to come. Climb the wall of Uruk, walk upon it, inspect the foundation terrace, and examine the brickwork. Is it not of baked brick? And did not the 7 sages lay its plans? The archaeology of Uruk, modern Waqar, deep in the southern alluvium of Iraq, confirms the grandeur that the epic exalts. German expeditions beginning in 1912, resumed after the World Wars, have revealed a stratigraphy reaching back to the Uruk period, c. 4000–3100 BCE, the age when the world's first true city emerged from the mud of the Euphrates plain. Here massive circuit walls of stamped clay and fired brick encircled an urban expanse of nearly 6 square kilometers, enclosing shrines, canals, and markets where tens of thousands lived. Archaeologists uncovered the great Anu Ziggurat, its white temple summit once gleaming against the desert sky, and the Ina precinct, a sacred complex to Inanna/Ishtar layered through centuries of rebuilding. Cylinder seals from these levels bear the earliest known pictographic writing, the ancestor of cuneiform, and administrative tablets from around 3300 BCE record the measured distribution of grain and wool that sustained the city's life. These findings lend flesh to the epic's final vision. Uruk was not only a city of men, but a proclamation of human destiny. That clay, when fired in the kilns of collective purpose, can outlast the fragile body. Its walls, in some stretches more than 9 kilometers long, were engineered to resist flood and invasion, a testament to the crafts of masons whose names are lost yet whose work endures after 5 millennia. The very bricks, impressed with the wedge-shaped marks of early scribes, still carry the fingerprints of those who shaped them, a silent liturgy of permanence against the floodwaters that once erased the world. For Gilgamesh, the sight of these walls is revelation. He began his journey to escape the decree of death. He returns to find meaning not in endless breath, but in the enduring city shaped by mortal minds and hands. His praise of Uruk echoes the royal hymns of Sumer and Akkad, where kings celebrated the building of temples as participation in the order of heaven. It anticipates, too, the later Psalms of Jerusalem, walk about Zion, go round about her, count her towers, and the Qur letter to be a Macron NIC vision of human stewardship, where righteous labor on earth becomes a form of worship. In the bricks of Uruk, as in the sacred precincts of later ages, the finite becomes the vessel of the eternal. This closing tableau is steeped in paradox. The same fire that hardens clay to endure is also the element of destruction. The same river that once carried away the plant of life brought the silt from which the city was made. Uruk's walls proclaim triumph over chaos, yet they also mark the mortal boundary. The city endures, but each citizen passes. Mesopotamian theology accepted this tension. Funerary texts from and Nippur, contemporary with the earliest levels of Uruk, speak of the Kaigal, the great place, where all must one day dwell. Death is universal, but within the allotted span humans may build works that reflect the cosmic order and thus share, if only in memory, the permanence of the divine. Modern excavations have traced these truths in brick and earth. Beneath the windswept mound of Wakar, layers of habitation reveal flood deposits, rebuildings, and long abandonment, yet the core of the city still rises, its walls scarred but unfallen. Standing upon those remnants today, one can still walk the line where Gilgamesh is said to have stood, feeling the weight of centuries press upward through the soles. So the king who sought life without end returns not with the herb of immortality, but with a deeper vision. He bids the traveler to behold the handiwork of Uruk, to read in its fired bricks the name and labor of a people who accepted mortality and yet defied oblivion. The eternal walls of clay and fire become his final testament, that though flesh returns to dust, the works of human craft, consecrated by purpose and memory, can shine across the ages like the very stars that rise above the plain of Shinar. The king who once sought to escape the silence of the grave now chooses a different immortality. When Gilgamesh commands that his story be carved into enduring clay, the hero who feared oblivion accepts the only permanence the gods allow, the memory preserved in words. The standard Babylonian version of the epic, compiled and shaped by the learned scribe Sinlekyun-Nini between roughly 1300 and 1000 BCE, fulfills this final decree. Upon tablets of river mud, baked in the kilns of scribal houses from Babylon to Nineveh, the tale of cedar forests, heavenly bulls, and the search for eternal life was inscribed line by line, its wedge-shaped cuneiform pressed by stylus into damp clay. In those tablets, still surviving after 3 millennia, the mortal king becomes what he desired, a name that does not fade. The tablet itself is a tombstone and a resurrection. Mesopotamian scribes understood writing as more than record. It was the shipru, the mission of the word, capable of summoning the presence of gods and kings across time. Royal inscriptions from the 3rd millennium BCE, etched on diorite and limestone, called future generations to remember their builders and invoked curses upon any who might deface the text. To write was to bind a soul to eternity. The Epic of Gilgamesh opens and closes with this conviction, inviting the listener to climb the wall of Uruk, and read the story that the king himself caused to be engraved, so that his life might endure when flesh and breath were dust. This vision finds deep resonance in later sacred literatures. The Torah of Israel, written and redacted between the 10th and 5th centuries BCE, presents the covenant as words carved first on stone by the finger of God, tablets that outlast the wilderness and carry divine law beyond death. The Avesta of Zoroastrian Persia, whose hymns were orally preserved and then committed to writing under the Sasanian kings, embodies the eternal data, the cosmic order expressed as scripture. The Qur letter 2b, a macron n, revealed in the 7th century CE, speaks of the al-Kitab, the mother of the book, a heavenly archetype of which the earthly recitation is a reflection. In each tradition, the written word is not merely memory, but revelation, a bridge between mortal brevity and the timeless decree of heaven. The rediscovery of Gilgamesh's own tablets in modern times reenacts this ancient promise. Buried beneath the mounds of Kyanjik at Nineveh, the library of Ashurbanipal yielded its treasure in 1849, when Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam unearthed thousands of cuneiform fragments. From these shards, the Assyriologist George Smith pieced together the epic's flood narrative, and in 1872 read it before the Society of Biblical Archaeology, startling a Victorian audience with a scripture older than Genesis. What Gilgamesh sought was thus fulfilled. His name, pressed into clay more than 2.5 millennia earlier, spoke again to a distant world. The dust of Uruk turned to living voice. Archaeological context magnifies the meaning of this literary tomb. In Mesopotamia, writing itself emerged in the late 4th millennium BCE, when temple accountants of the Uruk period impressed tokens and pictographs onto wet clay to track the flow of grain and wool. Over centuries, these marks became cuneiform, the script that would bear the hymns of Enkidu, the laws of Hammurabi, and the laments of ruined cities. To carve a tablet was to enlist the elemental forces of earth and fire, clay drawn from the river, water to moisten, stylus to inscribe, kiln to harden. Each step echoed the work of creation, transforming mud into a vessel of eternal speech. Gilgamesh's final command therefore binds his life to the very medium that defined civilization. The tablet as tombstone also resolves the paradox at the heart of the epic. The king cannot live forever, yet through the permanence of writing he attains a different kind of eternity. His walls may crumble, his gardens turn to dust, but the words endure, capable of crossing empires and languages. They traveled from Sumerian poems of the early 2nd millennium BCE to Akkadian adaptations, to the standard Babylonian edition shaped by Sinlekion Nini, and finally to the scholars of modern Europe. Each recopying, each translation is a resurrection, a proof that memory can outlast the body. Thus the epic closes where it began, at the gates of Uruk, with the invitation to read. The king who once raged against the limits of flesh now rests within the clay that bears his name. His tomb is not a mound of earth, but the text itself, a scripture that joins the great canons of the world, the Torah, the Avesta, the Qur letter 2b, a macron n, in asserting that the spoken and written word can defy oblivion. Through these tablets Gilgamesh, son of Lugalbanda, king of Uruk, still speaks, his quest for immortality fulfilled not in unending breath, but in the indelible permanence of story, a monument of fired clay where mortal striving becomes eternal remembrance. The epic's last tablet opens with a voice from the shadowed plain where no sunlight falls. After the triumphant return to Uruk and the sober praise of its enduring walls, the narrative turns once more to the friend whose death set the king upon his restless journey. Tablet XII, preserved among the cuneiform fragments of the 7th century BCE library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, recounts how Gilgamesh, still haunted by longing, petitions the gods to let him see Enkidu again. Through the intercession of E and the sun god Shamus, the earth splits and the ghost of the wild man rises, a wraith formed of dust and lament. This closing scene stands apart from the careful architecture of the preceding tablets, echoing instead the older Sumerian poem Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, composed perhaps 1,000 years earlier and woven into the epic by later scribes. The encounter is stark and without comfort. Gilgamesh embraces the shade of his companion, but his arms close on emptiness, like the mist of dawn. He begs to know what awaits the dead. Enkidu answers with words that chill the heart. The underworld is a house of dust, a realm where kings and slaves alike eat clay and sit in darkness, where the crowns of once mighty rulers lie discarded, and the priests of the great temples serve as common servants. Only those whose families pour libations and bring offerings find a little solace. Those who die unburied wander thirsty forever. The tablet lingers on these details, as if to press into the living mind the certainty of decay and the equality of death. Such visions draw from the deepest currents of Mesopotamian belief. Administrative and liturgical texts from Nippur, and Kish, many dating to the 3rd millennium BCE, describe the Kur, the great below, as a vast cavern beneath the earth ruled by Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. Funerary tablets and the descent of Inanna speak of 7 gates, each demanding a token of power from the entrant, until the soul stands naked before the judges of Anu and Enlil. Offerings of bread, beer, and water were thought essential, a duty of the living to sustain their ancestors. Archaeologists working in the Royal Cemetery of excavated 1922–1934 by Leonard Woolley, uncovered libation channels and offering tables beside the tombs, silent evidence of rites meant to ease the lot of the departed in the dust-dark house. The bleak equality of this underworld finds striking parallels across the ancient world. In the Hebrew scriptures, the dead descend to Sheol, the land of silence, where both righteous and wicked dwell together until the final judgment. Psalmists cry that the dead do not praise the Lord, capturing the same sense of shadowed inactivity that Enkidu laments. Islamic tradition names the intermediate realm Barzakh, a barrier between life and resurrection where souls await the day of account, tasting either peace or foreboding according to their earthly deeds. Greek poets sang of Hades, a mist-shrouded kingdom across the river Styx, where shades drink forgetfulness and only heroic favor or divine theft can bring a soul back to light. Though differing in theology, these visions share the Mesopotamian intuition that death is a state of dim suspension, relieved only by the prayers of the living or the mercy of heaven. Scholars have long debated the place of tablet XII within the epic. Its style and theology diverge from the majestic arc that ends with the city walls of Uruk. Many see it as an older Sumerian tale later appended by the learned scribe Sinlekyunnini, FL. c. 1300–1000 BCE, who wove disparate traditions into the standard Babylonian version. yet its presence is fitting. After the king's hard-won acceptance of mortality, the voice of Enkidu's ghost seals the lesson. Even friendship, even the memory of great deeds, must pass through the same gate of dust. The meeting of living king and dead companion is therefore more than a final lament. It is a ritual reenactment of the ancestor cult that sustained Mesopotamian cities. Gilgamesh calls, the gods permit, the dead return for a breath and a word, and then the gulf closes again. In that brief communion, the human yearning to bridge death finds expression. Just as later Jews would pray Kaddish for their departed, Christians would celebrate the Eucharist as communion of saints, and Muslims would offer Du letter 2bf a Macron letter 2be at the graveside. The epic stands at the fountainhead of this universal impulse, to speak with those who have gone before and to keep their memory alive through story and rite. Thus the final tablet ends not in triumph, but in the soft cadence of grief and recognition. The ghost of Enkidu fades back into the earth, the king remains among the living, and the house of dust closes once more. Gilgamesh, who sought the plant of life and the secret of the flood, has learned what all mortals must, that the only bridge across death is remembrance, and the only immortality is the word inscribed in clay. In the silence after Enkidu's lament, the epic itself becomes that bridge, a tablet that defies the grave, carrying the names of friends and the wisdom of loss across the centuries of dust and fire. The Mesopotamian dead were believed to travel not to a realm of reward or torment, but to a kingdom of stillness. Scribes called it the Kur, the great below, a place beneath the mountains where sunlight never reached, and where every soul, whether king or servant, shared the same fate. The final tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh alludes to this shadowed world when the ghost of Enkidu speaks of the house, where those who wear crowns sit in darkness, and the kings of the earth are equal to the lowest slave. Death, in this oldest of literatures, is not a passage to glory, but a return to silence and dust. Texts from across Mesopotamia elaborate the vision. The descent of Inanna, preserved on Sumerian tablets dating to 1900–1600 BCE, describes the Queen of Heaven passing through 7 gates into the realm of her sister Ereshkigal, each gate stripping her of regalia until she stands naked before the judges of the dead. Akkadian incantations and the so-called laments for the dead, copied in Nippur and between the 18th and 14th centuries BCE, portray the same dread dominion. A cavern where the dead drink from muddy ditches, clothed in feathers, their voices reduced to whispers. Offerings from the living, libations of beer and water, bread set on altars, were essential to ease this drear existence, for without them the shades grew restless and wandered hungry through the streets of the living. Archaeology reinforces the written record. The royal cemetery of uncovered by Sir Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, revealed royal tombs that were not monuments of triumph, but portals to the underworld. Within the deep death pits, entire courts of attendants lay beside their lords, many having taken a final draught of narcotic to follow their ruler into eternity. Lyres adorned with golden bull heads, drinking vessels of silver, and libation tubes of clay testify to rituals meant to sustain the departed in the shadow house. Comparable strata at Kish contain communal burials and channels for offerings, silent evidence of a culture that saw death as a continuing relationship between the living city and the realm below. The Mesopotamian house of dust stands in both contrast and conversation with other ancient eschatologies. Across the Nile, Egyptians of the Old Kingdom, c. 2600 BCE, composed the pyramid texts and later the Book of the Dead, envisioning an afterlife of judgment and renewal. There the heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of M, a letter to BF, a T, and the righteous, vindicated, sail with the sun god through fields of reeds. Death becomes a passage to glory, not a leveling silence. In Zoroastrian Iran, hymns of the Avesta describe the soul's crossing of the Chinvat Bridge, where good thoughts, words, and deeds determine whether one enters the fragrant house of song or plunges into the realm of the lie. Moral distinction, absent in Mesopotamian cosmology, is central to this Iranian vision. Later Abrahamic faiths draw yet different lines. Early Israel knew Sheol, a place of gloom and forgetfulness strikingly akin to the Sumerian Kur, but Jewish apocalyptic writings of the Second Temple period began to promise resurrection and judgment. Christianity, shaped by those hopes, spoke of purgatory, a realm of purifying fire where souls are cleansed before entering the presence of God. Islam teaches of Barzakh, the barrier world between death and the resurrection, where the righteous experience peace and the wicked taste a foreknowledge of punishment. Each of these traditions invests death with ethical consequence, transforming the neutral Mesopotamian underworld into a stage of divine justice. Yet the House of Dust retains a peculiar dignity. Its democracy is absolute. Kings and peasants, warriors and scribes, all return to the same clay. Death here is not merely penalty, but the necessary counterweight to life's clamor, a conviction already voiced in the Atrahasis' epic, 18th century BCE, where the gods decree mortality to preserve cosmic balance. The libations poured by descendants, the careful maintenance of tombs, and the recitation of ancestral names testify to a worldview in which remembrance is the only immortality offered to humankind. Standing amid the ruins of Ur or Kish today, one can still sense that silent expectation. Beneath the windblown mounds lie the vaulted chambers where musicians once played for the dead, where clay offerings awaited unseen hands. The great ziggurats that rise above the plain were not merely temples to the living gods, but markers of the unseen world below, stairways for the spirits who traveled endlessly between earth and underworld. To walk these sites is to feel the truth Enkidu's ghost confided to Gilgamesh, that every life, however radiant, descends at last into a realm where crowns crumble, where voices fade, and where only the memory carried by the living keeps a flicker of light within the house of dust and silence. Beneath the desolate mounds of northern Mesopotamia, where the winds of the Tigris sweep across fields of broken brick, a library once lay sleeping for more than 2 millennia. In the palatial ruins of ancient Nineveh, the last great capital of Assyria, the Epic of Gilgamesh rested in silence, its story pressed into clay and sealed by fire. The tablets themselves, etched in the standard Babylonian dialect between 1300 and 1000 BCE, recopied in the scribal schools of Babylon and later collected in the royal archive of King Ashurbanipal, are 668–627 BCE, had endured the fall of empires and the forgetting of languages. When Nineveh was sacked in 612 BCE, its walls burned, yet the flames only hardened the clay, turning fragile mud into imperishable stone. For centuries afterward, the earth covered the city, and the words of the world's oldest epic lay buried like a royal corpse, awaiting the day of resurrection. The rediscovery began in the middle of the 19th century, when British explorers sought the cities named in scripture. In 1849, Austin Henry Layard, digging into the mounds of Kyanjik on the eastern bank of the Tigris, uncovered chambers packed with shattered tablets, the royal library of Ashurbanipal. Thousands of fragments, baked by the ancient fires, bore the wedge-shaped script of cuneiform, a language then only partly understood. Among them lay the story of the restless king of Uruk, scattered across 100 pieces of clay. It was not until 1872 that George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist in the reading room of the British Museum, painstakingly joined those fragments and read aloud the tale of the Great Flood and the search for eternal life. His announcement shocked Victorian England. Here was a narrative older than Genesis, yet echoing its themes with uncanny precision. The ancient book had risen from the dust, its voice clear after 3,000 silent years. In the faiths that inherited Mesopotamia's memory, the very idea of a book carries sacred weight. Judaism speaks of the Torah written by the finger of God, the scrolls of the law that accompany Israel through wilderness and exile. Christianity proclaims the Logos, the eternal word through whom all things were made, and treasures the canon of Scripture as both history and living presence. Islam venerates the Qur'an as the uncreated speech of God, preserved eternally on the heavenly al-Kitab, the mother of the book, before its earthly recitation to the prophet. In each tradition, the book is more than parchment or ink. It is revelation, covenant, and immortality. To bury such a text is not to silence it, but to entrust it to the keeping of time until its appointed unveiling. The Epic of Gilgamesh shares this destiny. Like a body interred and later raised, it passed through death and returned. Its tablets were shaped from river mud, inscribed with a reed stylus, and hardened in the furnaces of empire, a union of clay and fire that made them both vulnerable and everlasting. The fires of conquest, meant to annihilate, instead ensured survival. The forgotten library became a tomb in which the words of the ancient king were perfectly embalmed, waiting for scholars to breathe life into their lines once more. When George Smith read the Flood Tablet before the Society of Biblical Archaeology, newspapers from London to New York marveled that the voice of a Sumerian king, sung by Akkadian scribes, could speak again with such clarity. The Victorian public, steeped in the authority of the Bible, confronted a text that predated their scriptures, yet mirrored them in flood and covenant. The epic's reappearance altered not only the study of ancient history, but the understanding of sacred tradition, reminding a modern world that revelation is older and broader than any single creed. In this resurrection, the epic fulfills its own final prophecy. At the end of the narrative, Gilgamesh commands that his deeds be carved on stone so that his name will never perish. His wish is granted not through immortal flesh, but through the endurance of written word. The clay tablets are his tombstone and his gospel, enduring when the palaces of Uruk crumbled and the names of countless kings were forgotten. Today, fragments of those very tablets rest in museums from London to Baghdad, their wedge-shaped signs still sharp to the eye, carrying across 5,000 years the breath of a civilization that refused to vanish. Thus the Epic of Gilgamesh stands beside the Torah, the Avesta, the Gospels, and the Qur'an as testimony to the mysterious covenant between the human word and eternity. Buried in the earth like a body and raised again in an age of steam and telegraph, it reveals that writing itself can conquer death. The book that slept beneath Nineveh's dust now speaks across continents, a monument of clay and fire through which the mortal king achieved the immortality he sought. and through which the ancient world still whispers its wisdom to the living.